We are extremely excited today. I'm going to close this window so you don't hear the street. We're very excited today to have, for the first time, two speakers at the same time. We have a twin. And we have Dani Bassett, that you all know, and we have Perry Zurn. And they both have been just submitting a new book together called Curious Minds, that is at the intersection of studying curiosity from philosophy, political philosophy, and from neuroscience, and I guess collective structures as well as network structures in the brain perspective. And I'm particularly excited this time because these two fields or not two, there's multiple fields that will be involved in today's sessions that I'm very excited about. Before going into that, I just want to start by saying, if this is your first time here, the Learning Salon is a weekly forum where we discuss interdisciplinary bridges and contentions about biological and artificial learning. We usually have a very diverse and interdisciplinary audience. So we have philosophers, we have neuroscientists, we have computational.
Sorry, I'll just go ahead and mute you, John.
From various disciplines, we have had ML people, RL people, we've had vision people, we've had navigation, machine learning folks. And one of the key principles here is that you can ask a question for clarification in the chat, and any questions you have directly to the speakers, you can ask in the Ask a Question area. The questions in the chat will be addressed by somebody on the screen, or Brad or Kanaka or Claire or Eva, who are behind the scenes, or us if we see it in time. But if we don't see it, they will bring it up to our attention. The questions in the Ask a Question area, please vote on each other's questions so it can come up. As we've mentioned at the beginning of many salons, although intellectual disagreement, even if it's strong disagreement, is encouraged to be expressed, we have a very strong commitment to being respectful, and no sort of hate speech or disrespect is tolerated, including speaking over others, especially speaking over minorities. That's absolutely not tolerated. You've probably seen it. Even if somebody is very high ranking, we definitely stop them. Sometimes Jovo stops them, sometimes I stop them, sometimes John stops them. We make sure people don't talk all over each other. Sometimes when it happens in the heat of a discussion and it seems normal, it might get out of our hands. If it so happens, please let us know. If the hate speech issue gets violated, unfortunately, we will have to exclude someone from the audience. And that will be handled by our support team behind the scenes. So let's make sure that we adhere to the rules and we're all aware of it. Okay. With that, I would love to maybe dive into it. So if you guys have a PowerPoint, you can bring it up while I just introduce. Usually we don't give formal introductions. Everyone here knows Dani Bassett. Dani Bassett is a professor of many things, including bioengineering, neuroscience, at UPenn, and all of us know Dani's work based on the various brain networks, her work on learning, etc. And Perry Zurn is a professor of political philosophy at American University, has written a number of very interesting books. One of them is right over here. This is Curiosity and Power, and I'm sure that there will be discussions of this today. And with that, I look forward to hearing everything. I will mute myself now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having us. Dani and I are incredibly excited to be here. Thanks, Ida, John, and Josh in particular for hosting us. And as we said in the emails, we rarely get a chance to speak with one another together on subjects that we work on, and so this is incredibly exciting. Dani, I don't know if you want to say some opening remarks.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm excited for today.
Great. So I wanted to contextualize a little bit of what we're doing today by just talking about the books that I've worked on personally and also in conjunction with Dani. So there's 3 of them that I'll be talking about just briefly. Curiosity Studies, which is an edited collection that came out last year, 2020. And in this book, we mobilize over people from over 14 different fields to talk about what curiosity really is and how it can be used or mobilized, and what are the real intriguing questions about curiosity that are raised across disciplines, but then how can they talk to each other? So we're really excited about that particular book. Curiosity and Power, that's my book that came out last month. And in this book, I really think about curiosity as the heartbeat of political resistance movements and as a central component of thinking about the battle over inquiry in an unequal world. So it's an unequal world, and that means that vying for questions and questioners from different perspectives happens. How do we approach that? And then lastly, Curious Minds is the book that Dani and I have written together. We're incredibly excited about this book. It has been probably the deepest pleasure of our respective careers to write this together. This is not the official cover. We don't have a cover yet, but it will stand in for now for us. And in it, we propose a network theory of curiosity. And I won't say more because I know Dani will be diving into it a little bit later today. I want to take a moment under the rubric of curiosity, power, and the shape of inquiry to just invite us to think about these phrases, curiosity, power, and the shape of inquiry alongside one another. And I want to begin with Virginia Woolf. So Virginia Woolf in 1942 wrote an essay entitled Why? ? And in it, she writes, but the great obstacle to asking questions openly in public is, of course, wealth. The little twisted sign that comes at the end of a question has a way of making the rich writhe. Power and prestige come down upon it with all their weight. Questions, therefore, being sensitive, impulsive, and often foolish, have a way of picking their asking place with care. They shrivel up in an atmosphere of power, prosperity, and time-worn stone. They die by the dozens on the threshold of great newspaper offices. They slink away to less favored, less flourishing quarters, where people are poor and therefore have nothing to give, where they have no power and therefore have nothing to lose. Virginia Woolf here is staging, I think, a conversation about curiosity and power. She's suggesting that curiosity antagonizes power structures and that power structures in turn attempt to squash curiosity. She adds to this that there are places where curiosity best thrives, and that is for her among the poor and the powerless, among those with nothing to give and nothing to lose. So she's characterizing curiosity as this force of social transformation, really from the bottom up and from the margins in. That's where curiosity lives for her, but where does curiosity go to die in some sense? For her, in this particular essay, it's churches and universities and newspaper offices, intriguingly enough. And there seems to be something right about this and also something wrong about this. So I want to say what's right, I think, in this context is she does a fantastic job of lampooning some of the traditions of university culture in which we consider ourselves a little bit too seriously, and thereby exclude really robust and vibrant conversations. That seems right. But what's wrong, I think, about it is that there are, in fact, lots of questions happening in the university setting. It's full of questions, as are newspaper offices. Is journalism something other than the asking of a series of questions? But are, in fact, what are these questions that live here? Would she argue that if they are here, that they're sort of vampiric? Are they wraiths? Are they ghost questions? Are they the Walking Dead questions? Or is it that they require they're a different species, perhaps? They require a different ecology in which they can thrive. Questions that function in a university setting or questions that function outside of it. In order to tackle this, what kinds of questions actually happen in the university, I want to turn to Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston published her autobiography also in 1942. Her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. And in it, she famously writes, "Research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose. It is a seeking that he who wishes may know the cosmic secrets of the world and they that dwell therein." Characterizing here research as formalized curiosity, Zora Neale Hurston invites us to think about how curiosity takes form. or takes shape, how it becomes formalized, and even how it becomes formulaic. How does curiosity become formulaic? By what force, by what logic is curiosity formed? But we also have to ask some normative questions. What forms ought curiosity to take? I mean, are all forms good? Why or why not? What shapes might it aspire to take? What perhaps oppressions or social hierarchies or inequalities might those shapes support or resist? And are formulas of curiosity in fact a problem? Is it a problem when curiosity becomes formulaic? Or is that okay? And what kind of formulas might be liberatory in some sense? We're talking here for Zurn Hurston about research being formalized curiosity, but perhaps we could extend this well beyond that. So could we consider education to be formalized research or curiosity? Could we consider data surveillance to be formalized curiosity? Could we consider healthcare a kind of formalized curiosity, or even algorithms? It's kind of formalized curiosity. What would that mean? For her, of course, she's in the midst of a competing understandings of anthropology. So she's trained in a particular form of anthropology where you go in as an outside observer and you simply see what is happening in a given society. You take your notes, you publish your paper, and that's it. And she's one of the ones who is credited with the participant observer technique in anthropology that insists you must become a part of a community in order to understand it at all, and in order to accountably and rightly kind of record its own self-understanding, that community's own self-understanding. So for her, not only is research formalized curiosity, but there are competing formalizations of any given research kind in the university setting. And certainly this might also be true in education. Are there competing formalizations of curiosity in education, in journalism, in healthcare, etc.? In order to tackle that, one of the places I go, or the kinds of further questions I want to ask, I turn to Michel Foucault, who is a late 20th century French philosopher. And he is credited with an understanding, a conceptualization of discursive formations. So he says the way we talk about things, discourse, is formed. And paying attention to how it's formed allows us to change, but also to appreciate, and also to resist ways in which things are talked about. He talks about discursive formations. I want to talk about curiosity formations. So I want to extend his work to think about how is it that curiosity is formed and develops into formations. And to do this, I ask a series of questions, and these I would keep returning to these. I think they're really helpful to think about how has curiosity been shaped. Who are the subjects who question and who are most expected to be questioners? What concepts frame what it is possible to question? Obviously, this is going to be really different in different settings, in different discourses, in different disciplines and enterprises. But what concepts frame what it is possible to question? What strategies of questioning are deployed in order to question the questionable? What are the strategies of questioning? We call these methods sometimes, but what are these strategies of questioning, and what are the go-to ones? How did we get them? How did we get trained in them? How do we not even notice that that's the strategy of questioning that's deployed? And then which styles of curiosity are most often legitimated and which ones go unrecognized? These kinds of questions allow us to start noticing that curiosity isn't just something that just sort of bubbles up inside us and here it is, I'm interested in this thing, but it's been shaped, it's been formed. It is this river with its own banks that have all kinds of sources, historical, social, personal, and otherwise. So this is one of the ways I start to think about curiosity, power, and the shape of inquiry. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dani.
Great. And yeah, I'd like to dwell on this idea of curious formation a little bit longer, particularly in the context of individual knowing, and even more specifically in the context of scientific knowing. So we can begin to place the idea of curious formation within the context of prior definitions of curiosity. So for example, Augustine in 397 writes that curiosity is a lust to experience and find out. Aquinas in 1270 writes that curiosity is the desire to know. Descartes in 1649, curiosity is a desire to understand. John Locke in 1693, curiosity is an appetite after knowledge. William James in 1899 writes that curiosity is the impulse towards better cognition. John Dewey in 1933 writes that curiosity is an interest in problems provoked by the observations of things and the accumulation of material. Voss in 1983 writes that curiosity is a motivational prerequisite of exploratory behavior. Lowenstein in 1994, curiosity is a feeling of deprivation produced by information gaps. And I think collectively, these definitions guide us to a different question, which is, what is it precisely that we are desirous of, or impulsive towards, or interested in, or deprived of, or driven towards? The answers that are posed here, knowledge, information, solutions to problems, better cognition, are commonly thought of as items, which, when acquired, are therefore satisfying. And in fact, this analogy between hunger and thirst and curiosity, as well as the analogy between food and drink and information, underscores the acquisitional nature of our common conceptualizations of curiosity. Moreover, we think of curiosity as valuable to us because when we acquire the item of information, our life gets better. Our uncertainty about the world is reduced, and we no longer feel deprived of information. Upon reflection, this acquisitional account of curiosity seems intuitive, yet if we press the account, if we allow acquisitional actions of humans to play out upon the theater of our experience, we quickly come to realize that we're missing a key piece of the puzzle. An acquisition or collection of informational bits does not constitute knowledge. Knowledge requires something more. Knowledge requires an understanding of the relations between bits, relations of cause, of correlation, and of consequence, to name a few. As John Dewey writes in his Democracy in Education, knowledge is a perception of those connections of an object which determine its applicability in a given situation. An ideally perfect knowledge would represent such a network of interconnections that any past experience would offer a point of advantage from which to get at the problem presented in a new experience. Or consider the perspective of Henri Poincaré when he writes in Science and Hypothesis, the aim of science is not things themselves, as the dogmatists in their simplicity imagine, but the relations among things. Outside these relations, there is no reality knowable. Or similarly, a century earlier, in Lorenz Oken's Elements of Physiophilosophy, he writes, science is a series of necessarily interdependent and consecutive propositions. So these latter two scientist-philosopher hybrids state very frankly what we intuitively appreciate. We cannot truly understand any item of knowledge until we understand its relations to other items of knowledge. And deciphering those relations is what science is about. So how might we expand the current acquisitional account of curiosity to an explicitly connectional account of curiosity? And if we did so, what sorts of affordances might such an account offer? The connectional account of curiosity casts curious humans as those who build networks. So they build by adding nodes and adding edges as they grow their body of knowledge. A compelling icon of connective curiosity is Maria Sibylla Merian, a German-born naturalist and scientific illustrator who published The Wondrous Transformation and Particular Food Plants of Caterpillars in 1679 at the age of 32. While her contemporaries cataloged isolated caterpillars on a page, Merian connected each caterpillar to its plant sustenance and to both its earlier and later morphologies. Her documentation of metamorphosis, showing the full life cycle from egg to caterpillar to pupa to either moth bird, which is what she called the moth, or summer bird, which is what she called the butterfly, went against the prevailing belief that caterpillars spontaneously came into being from non-living matter. Just as mice were thought to arise from a soiled shirt and wheat, scorpions were thought to arise from basil and brick, and frogs were thought to arise from fumes, according to some very well-defined recipes. Each connection from caterpillar to plant, or from caterpillar back to egg, or from caterpillar back to butterfly was an act of laying down an edge in the network of scientific knowledge. Using a more embodied description, it was a step. Curious minds engage in a kinesthetic practice by taking a step, 2 steps, 3 steps, eventually walking through knowledge space and picking up relations to structure their thought architectures. A useful image, I think, to have in our minds when we think about walking through knowledge spaces is this one on the right, taken from Charles Darwin's The Power of Movement in Plants, where he depicts the circumnutation of radicals, hypocotyls, epicotyls, and cotyledons. As the plant grows, the appendages step through physical space, tracing out paths of exploration. And similarly, we each walk along the links that connect bits of information in knowledge space, tracing out our own paths of epistemic exploration. The knowledge network inside each mind is therefore constantly evolving and growing in manners and directions that are idiosyncratic. We walk along the links that connect bits of information, and then we stand at the void and shout across. When we find or discover a unit of information that fully or partially fills that void, we have built a new bit of scaffold in our knowledge network. And in this framing, we can then ask, what are curiosity's walks? How are curiosity's walks similar or different? Which kinds of walks do we each choose? So we as humans, we move from thought to thought, from idea to idea. As scientists, we move from paper to paper, or talk to talk, or experiment to experiment. And even as citizens, we move from web page to web page, or book to book. As we engage in these movements, we are building, growing, laying down, and sharing our knowledge networks. And hence there exists an opportunity to characterize the sorts of connective shapes that we make, that we share with one another, or that we enjoy learning. How do we each walk differently on the network of Wikipedia? How do we each differently write or verbally communicate? What preferences do we each have for closing gaps, for making leaps, for spanning spaces? And how might those preferences impact the way we encode information in the brain and the clarity or dimensionality of the associated neural representations? These and related questions call for a mathematical language, such as network science, in which to formally characterize connective shapes. More broadly, the approach pulls us away from the notion of curiosity as acquisitional and its associated value structure of quantifying how curious one is, or dichotomizing the curious from the not curious. Instead, the approach frames curiosity as connectional, and its associated value structure is one of valuing a diversity of shapes. It's not whether one is curious, but how one is curious that matters here. The value lies in multiplying, not governing, the hows. And with that, I think we've passed through most of the content that we wanted to share with you today, and we'd love to get to the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So, yeah, maybe we do a vocal.
Applaud without being muted.
Also, thank you so much for keeping within the time limits. Usually we sort of look the other way when people go over time, but you didn't even go over time. So I think that a couple of times I've been asking the first question. So this time, John, do you want to go first?
I actually do. I'm so glad you did that. Listen, I actually read a whole bunch of your stuff, and I'm very excited about this because for many reasons. One is I can't think of something that epitomizes what this salon wants to do, right? I mean, it's the arts and the humanities and the sciences and philosophy and activism. I mean, that's here too. So I actually, Dani knows my brother, David, quite well, I think. And, you know, seeing you both here reminds me a little bit, and you know, my brother and I are twins. He'd probably be very relieved about that. We've been very interested in this notion of consilience as well, you know, bringing the arts and the humanities and the science together. And I think in your eLife paper, you were very much talk about bringing literature and philosophy into science. And so I wanted to ask two questions. One is, I was just wondering, how did you both go in those directions? I mean, I'm sort of interested about the two of you, if I may. In other words, going off into physics and math, and then going into philosophy, and then joining. Was this like a dialogue always, or was this sort of a late convergence? I'm just sort of interesting how you both are so different and yet have come together in this way. I mean, I think it's just interesting to see how this unfolded. I hope that's not too personal.
Dani, you should start.
So I think that, let's see, we diverged in college, I would say. So I was a physics major, and Perry majored in philosophy. And then through grad school, we were talking to one another about the ways in which we were thinking, what we were working on. But I don't think we actually came to something that we could both contribute to until probably the beginning of our faculty positions. So it was a late convergence in that sense, although that was 7 years ago.
I see. And was it on the curiosity notion that was the nidus for it?
Yeah, that's how I see it, but I don't know, Perry, you want to add?
Yeah, I would say we it's interesting that we both ended up in two of the least diverse fields in the academy. So I remember us talking about that, being in physics and philosophy, and why would it be these places in particular where we found ourselves. Both of the fields I think are really theoretically rich, and kind of bend your understanding of what the world even is, but from two different perspectives. And I think that for both of us, we came from a sort of a background that didn't have a lot of room in the world. And so I think there was an attraction to fields that really mess with how you see the world. And then it really started, I was finishing my PhD on curiosity, and Dani at the time was doing work on flexibility and network structures. But I think it was specifically your flexibility paper, and I thought, you know what, we have to talk about curiosity. We should talk about curiosity sometime. Dani was like, okay.
Yeah, and then sort of going from yes, it's absolutely true. I mean, philosophy is just a nightmare. I've seen a lot of the figures for philosophy departments. I don't know as much for physics, but I feel it sort of, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just somewhat more shocked when you see just how embarrassingly undiverse philosophy is. I mean, I just felt like physics would be even worse, but philosophy, I think, so yes, it's incredible. Boy, do they need to be blown up. So that's fantastic. On the issue of philosophy and literature and the humanities, this comes up a lot in the Salon, and and David and I have also talked a lot about this. It seems to me, and I'd be interested to hear what you both do, that scientists, especially neuroscientists, would very much benefit from more literature and philosophy in the way they think about things. It's like a world knot, right? There are philosophical problems shot right through the heart of the neuroscience and AI enterprise. But it doesn't happen that much. I was just wondering whether you think and obviously it's very interesting to see some of the notions of curiosity benefit from a formal analysis. There's a sort of delicious paradox in something that's quite vague, like curiosity, being nevertheless subject to formalism. I find that kind of gives me a little bit of cognitive dissonance in itself. We could talk about that later. But I was just wondering, do you think, my feeling, and I've been out in the open about this, is that the scientists would benefit hugely from spending more time with people in the humanities and philosophy. I'm not so convinced that it's true in the other direction, right? But I was just wondering, is this part of, even though there's a particular topic which we'll talk about, this general consilience of bringing the humanities and philosophy and science together to enrich the projects of the scientists and the philosophers, that's an ongoing project in general, right, that we should be in favor of. Do you agree that we should be doing more of that and getting more philosophy into neuroscience graduate programs and getting people to read novels more? I mean, being familiar with Virginia Woolf, not just an echo from your distant undergraduate past. I mean, should this be an ongoing project, do you think, to bring these fields together for each of them to be better?
Yeah, I definitely think so. So I think that, when I think about neuroscience right now, I think that the iconic good neuroscience study is one that uses the best technologies and then uses the best data science techniques and does something amazing with data that is collected today, basically, right? With today's best, whatever that happens to be. And I think that that's extremely narrow-minded, that the kind of questions that we need to be addressing are questions that have been around for a long time. The big questions, the hard questions, are those that have not been here just today. They've been here before. And there are many disciplinary approaches and non-disciplinary approaches to asking those questions and posing those questions, and we will only know about them from consulting past work. So work in philosophy or in literature or in other areas of the humanities. I think that these blinders of sort of, I call it temporal precedence, we're better because we're now, is narrowing what we can do, and that we need to acknowledge that there is so much to learn from the way that human minds have asked questions and posed questions about thought and about cognition for at least 2,000 years, and that we should be that should help to frame what the important and kind of perennial questions are. I think that ignoring history is a mistake in a lot of ways, and I think we can end up spinning with the newest best today, and not asking the deeper questions.
Yeah, I'm spinning with agreement. You're beautifully stated. Perry, what do you think about that consilience?
Yeah, I would say that what's really wonderful about working across fields that are as different or as currently disconnected as ours is that it can make our projects strange, our disciplinary propensities strange, and in making them strange, it allows us to see them from another angle. They actually take a kind of shape before us, whereas before they were in a sense invisible. And I think that is precisely one of the great benefits of working across disciplines, first of all, but the same happens across time. So in philosophy, for example, if I could do a kind of philosophy that stays within the last 10 years as well, but certainly the longer look I have into the past and the ways in which a particular question like curiosity has been approached, the more I can see, wow, you thought that 2,000 years ago, and I think this, and what is that? How does that actually change our lives in good ways and in bad ways? So the making strange is, I think, precisely the benefit here, and in some sense a kernel of what makes curiosity possible, to suddenly notice this thing as a strange thing and inviting more questions.
Making strange is so wonderful. Yeah, the wonderful line, maybe somebody here knows where it comes from, which is, if you want to read about new ideas, read old work. If you want to hear about old ideas, read new work. Right? And it's so true, I find. I agree with you entirely. So I wanted to just, it reminded me a little bit, your wonderful treatment of busybodies, hunters and dancers. It reminded me a little bit of sort of Isaiah Berlin's dividing people into hedgehogs and foxes. Were you a little bit inspired by that fun thing as you take people and you sort of make them into a category? And I'm not saying that lightly or that you were being derivative in any way. What I mean is that there's something kind of very conceptually valuable playing that kind of game. I was wondering if you could say something about whether there was some inspiration from hedgehogs and foxes, or it was just sort of co-evolution.
Yeah, I would say that I was not thinking in particular about the hedgehog and the fox, although I came to think of that afterward, because the Busybody Hunter Dancer trilogy led me to think there can't just be three. And I started noticing at that point in time that there were many animal characters or animal figures for curiosity, and that would give us a far larger swath of ways of thinking about the practice of curiosity. And this is one of the components of the Curious Minds book with Dani. We've developed a specific curiosity bestiary that really digs into these practices from a much broader lens, which I think is fantastic. But was it fun to just drop people into categories? I mean, what was important for me about that project was that it began with a resistance to tracking the definitions of curiosity. So a lot of times, especially in philosophy, we focus on what is the definition and how do we need to revise the definition so it's a good definition of the thing. And so we continually return to defining what curiosity is. And I wanted to sidestep that entirely and ask, what does it look like when we do it? What does it look like on the ground? Mm-hmm. And looking for ways curiosity plays out, I ended up with these three figures across the history.
Okay, I'm going quickly, but I wanted to ask you. So that's wonderful. The other thing I found when I was reading your stuff was I found myself oscillating between curiosity sort of as an extremely powerful metaphor for a lot of what you guys want to do, versus trying to not see it slip and slide into two other things which seem to be quite close to it. And I'd be interested, is creativity versus curiosity, and criticality, critical theory, Frankfurt School, taking on an ideological critique of your society, the sort of Zizekian approach of everyone thinks A, but I'm going to show you through critical thinking that I can invert it paradoxically on its head, right? So, and the Derridian sort of critical way of doing things. So can you help me just see whether you feel that there's a lot of overlap and you could have put the word creativity or criticality into some of these treatments, or does curiosity operate as a subordinate, a superordinate term? Because I've found myself feeling a certain slippage in terms of those three C's. Do you see what I'm saying? Being critical, being creative, being curious. And it doesn't come up much in the stuff that I've seen so much, and I haven't read all of your stuff, but I never saw a sort of direct take on those other C words.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I understand myself as taking a critical theory approach to curiosity, and that to me means that I pay attention to how curiosity functions and is formed by institutions and discourses. That's what I take critical theory to be doing, and so I understand myself to have a critical theory approach to curiosity. Mm-hmm. Creativity, I think, needs a critical theory approach, given the kind of work that's out there right now on creativity, but it is not something I've yet really tackled. But Dani, I feel like you were going to jump in about creatures, animals.
Oh, I was just going to say that from a scientific perspective, and then I'll get back to creativity and criticality here. From a scientific perspective, the busybody, hunter, and dancer are really interesting dimensional phenotypes. So you can think about somebody or a stone that's not curious as kind of a point in some space. You can think of the busybody as gathering independent units of information. So it's almost like they're one-dimensional. You can think about the hunter as somebody who's moving in a two-dimensional space, mapping out a line or a curve. And then you can think about the dancer as somebody who is moving in the plane and then jumping in a third dimension to another bit of the plane and then jumping. So it does have a nice dimensional nature to it that is feels more natural maybe than just saying there are three kinds. It's three kinds of three different dimensions, right? And we can actually press that, Perry and I have talked about this, press that into a fourth dimension by just saying that people themselves can move among different types over time. So it's not necessarily that one person stays a busybody for all of their life, but may have a moment of busybodiness and a moment of hunterishness and a moment of dancerishness. And we move differently in different spaces, different dimensionalities of spaces at different times. So I just wanted to kind of loop that back to a little bit of a way of thinking about it from a math perspective. But then I think that creativity is definitely interesting. I'm not sure. I do think of curiosity as a building operation or a building practice, a building of knowledge, but that building of knowledge can happen in someone's mind without them ever showing anything in the real world. And I'm very invested in making sure that we have ways of talking about curiosity that don't require extensive interaction with the world. So the kid who's in the back of the classroom and doesn't raise their hand and never speaks can still be one of the most curious people in the room. And we need to have ways of defining or practicing or acknowledging the practices of curiosity that are true for that person too. So I think for me, that pushes curiosity and the way we're thinking about it far from creativity, unless it's kind of a very internal creativity in your mind.
because even creativity, right? I mean, a lot of people talking about domain jumping, right? The ability to take seemingly disparate domains and bringing them together, which reminded me a little bit of the kind of knight's move that you talk about for the dancer, right? Rather than the pawn versus the bishop. So that's really interesting. And then the other thing that it's interesting you should say about you can sometimes be one or the other. I did find myself struggling sometimes, and I think there's a line in Perry's essay on these three modes where sometimes you make it look like you don't want it to be a trait, but more of a sort of state. And yet now Dani's making it sound like also you can go into that state at certain different times. And actually, I think there's a very funny on creativity YouTube video by John Cleese where he talks about creativity being a state rather than a trait. So is there at least some agreement that whether it's externally imposed or whether it's your own lifeline, that you're more in the state way of thinking rather than the trait? Would that be correct?
From my perspective, I want to steer clear of both state and trait conceptualizations of curiosity. I like to think about curiosity as a practice. So in that particular essay, I talk about these as being kinesthetic signatures of curiosity, ways in which curiosity moves. And that's different than a state or a trait. A way of moving, a way of doing, a practice is a way of thinking about curiosity that opens up a lot of other questions that for me, especially as a political philosopher, are particularly interesting.
So just so I understand that, so the sort of being kinesthetically in expressing one particular one of those modes, are you saying that's because it's out in the world as a movement versus just a sort of an internal state that you're in? Is that the difference? I'm not quite capturing the huge divide between being in motion versus being in a state. Does it do more work for you to make that distinction?
Yes, because for me, then I can be divorced from a feeling or from something, a trait, a personality trait that I'm born with and I just have all the time. I want to think about how curiosity functions in the world, and that also gets me away from a purely human perspective of curiosity. So I want to think about ways that curiosity might function in the more than human world, among more than human organisms, other kinds of.
So last two little themes, on this, the other thing that I'm struck by reading all of your work together and alone is it seems to me a little bit divided between sort of saying something about knowledge and about how one can make unexpected leaps like the dancer. So this is more about how science and philosophy and the human knowledge enterprise is constructed and thought about, versus the more ethico-political side of it. In other words, how to speak truth to power. How do we, and I got the impression, and tell me if I'm wrong, that there was something a bit conformist about the hunter and a bit more radical about the dancer, and that whether it's the way you think in an academic environment as a dancer, or whether you're going to speak truth to power in a Foucault sense, that one should do it as a dancer. But they seem to me two different dimensions of this general framework. One is about how we can all do better knowledge generation and understand things. And the other one is, I think Perry in particular, how we can actually do something about the status quo from a political, ethical, queer theory, race theory. Are these two parallel channels that are just borrowing from the same deep well of ideas, or do you think that these are intertwined and not just connected by the core ideas? Oh, you're muted.
There we go. It just takes a second. So your question is, if I'm understanding correctly, what the attention to curiosity and its contribution to knowledge on the one hand, and its contribution to social change on the other.
Yes.
And are these simply parallel tracks of interest, or are they somehow connected?
Yes.
Yeah, and for me, they're absolutely connected, because the ways in which we structure knowledge, those ways are informed by social hierarchies. So it's not as if we can pursue constructing knowledge apart from recognizing social investments and disinvestments, in particular questions, questioners, and methods of questioning. So for me, they're intimately connected, although it's always helpful sometimes to pull apart and put back together. I don't know, Dani, if you want to speak to this.
Yeah, I think that the structures in our society can sometimes define, as Perry even mentioned, the channels along which an investigation can take place. And so a whole field may look like hunters because they're following a channel that's been defined by social structures around them or disciplinary structures around them. And therefore, kind of the nature of the questions, the nature of the curious practice is not something that we came up with inside of ourselves, but is something that is at least partially inherited by what is around us. And that makes you want to question, is this the way it needs to be, or can we get out of this river and choose a different river? So in that sense, they're connected, I think.
And my last question, actually for you, Dani, was the Wikipedia, sort of the way you used formalisms to go after busybodies and hunters, I believe, in the Wikipedia. And I read it and I thought, where did the dancers go in this analysis? So I was a bit disappointed, if I may say, that the most interesting figure, and I think I'm fair to say that the two of you like the dancers the best, and you know, so do I, obviously, but I was just wondering, where did the dancer go in that analysis? Is it because you don't have a formalism for them, or you just, there were no dancers on Wikipedia?
Yeah, I'm similarly disappointed in that part. So I think it's because we need a way of thinking about the dimensionality of the space to define that somebody's moving in kind of a third dimension. And to do that, we need not just distances between items or ideas or concepts, but we kind of need the angle in which people are moving. Like, are they moving straight, or are they leaping up? And so we have ideas and are working on the dancer now, but that's not something that made it into the first investigation.
So it almost, the specialness of the dancer is crying out for sort of an update to the formalism, right?
Yes, that's right.
That's cool. That's very, very interesting. All right. Well, of course, you know, I could hog you forever, but I want to thank you both. This has been wonderful. And I'll cede the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And yeah, this has been very exciting. Before I say something, I want to remind the junior members of the audience that we really encourage junior members to ask their questions. If you don't want to be called on screen or something, you can say, ask for me, and we will ask for you the questions. And please vote on each other's questions too. And we lost Jovo, and he's back. Okay. So I have a couple of things to ask. So I might also take as long as John did. Unfortunately, I'll try to be fast. But I have a series of questions that might be related to each other. One thing I might need to say is my graduate degree, so I first did a graduate degree in philosophy, in history and philosophy of science. And then in my first conference, my first paper that was like, reviewed and everything, I realized, oh, there are some people and whatever they say goes. And it doesn't matter. Like, I'm an immigrant woman of color, like that whatever they say goes. And it's going to take me years of having to like get my voice across. But then I know math and I've been coding because my undergrad was in computer science. So, but there, I didn't need to, it wasn't like whatever goes, like an equation could be there and I didn't need to speak for it as much. Little did I know. But anyway, so that's how I thought, okay, computational neuroscience, I'll do my philosophy of mind thing. I'll bring in political philosophy through some collective structures at some point. And, I'll come back to this. My philosophy and neuroscience PhD program, it was at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain. You had to have one advisor who was a philosopher and one that was a neuroscientist. And that kind of worked out for those years. And we were also on the side a member of Association of Neuroaesthetics, where, we had conferences like Unknowing the Given. I sort of designed this thing with the artist called Seeing with Eyes Closed. We gave talks everywhere. We wrote manifestos. We gave talks at Guggenheim, etc. Then I came out of my PhD and I realized, oh, that was a bubble. Like everywhere else, it's not a requirement of people's programs to have like this combined kind of philosophy and science combined thing, and then be encouraged to participate in art science interactions on the side. I realized that was an entire bubble. What I want to ask about regarding this whole sort of story, a couple of things came to me that I wanted to ask you guys about. One is the phenomenology of curiosity. I remember very well the feeling I have when I go to a room and everybody's an expert in a field I'm not familiar with. I know the rush, I know the sense of alienation, I know the discomfort of being an alien, and at the same time, the thrill of it, of like, oh, I could say something so dumb, and I could say something that sounds normal to me, and they could think it's brilliant. Like both of those are equally possible right now. So that phenomenology of it all of a sudden opens up an entire different kind of interaction or possibility of even perceiving what others are saying or engaging. So from both of your perspectives, I think my kind of background might be kind of at this point closer to Dani, but at some point it was closer to Perry because I was trained in Frankfurt School actually. So it's interesting to me to hear from both your perspectives. What do you think is this role of this thing that happens, whether it's about what happens in the brain or whether it's about the experience of it when we enter a field that we could be more curious in, or a room or a space?
Yeah, I love the invitation to think about the phenomenology of curiosity, and I think there's so much more work to be done there. I think the thread of curiosity is implicit in phenomenological texts, and there's work yet to really draw that out in some sense. But what I would say why I really appreciate the invitation is because as what's implicit in what you've said here is that curiosity isn't simply what happens up here. So it's not simply some kind of interaction in our brains, which is often the way it's talked about today in psychology and neuroscience. And it's not just what happens through our eyes, which is there's a much longer history of thinking of curiosity as ocular. But when you talk about the phenomenology of curiosity and how it is that it is experienced in particular ways, in particular settings, you said the sort of rush in your body, right? In your body. So that curiosity happens in a body beyond whatever this thing is up here. And I think there's so much more work to do to think of curiosity as a full-bodied practice and a full-bodied experience. And one of the purchases there is not just to break a long-standing habit for thousands of years of really locating the curiosity in the soul or the mind or the brain or the eyes, but also to account more carefully, I think, for how curiosity functions within differently able and disabled body minds. So when certain parts of our bodies function really differently, really non-normatively, it's not that curiosity is absent, it's that it appears differently, it appears anew, and how can we be attentive to that? So that's what makes me really excited about the injunction, but I have yet to really sort of follow the careful track of phenomenology of curiosity. But Dani?
Yeah, I also think that just considering the embodied nature of curiosity is important for even in the classroom. I'm still thinking of the kid in the back who doesn't ask the questions, and their body may be very nervous, and it's the teacher or instructor or lecturer's responsibility to create an environment that allows their mind to continue to be as free as it wants to be without requiring their bodies to do a particular thing, like raise their hand to ask a question or speak in front of the crowd. So I think it also makes me think about the responsibilities of many of us in ensuring that the room is one that is open both to bodies and to minds in their abilities that are obvious on the face of things, but also the ones that are not obvious, that you can't see immediately.
I think in the context of my PhD program, it was interesting that it was encouraged to just explore different areas in some ways. But you also had to bring it together in a cohesive thesis with 3 published papers by the end of it. So I think that kind of the two elements, the one that was a pressure towards synthesizing and the one that was a invitation and I guess like funding or creating opportunities for exploration. I think that the two components work together. I really agree that it's an embodied experience. I know it very well when, for instance, making music, when you do contact improv dance, various forms of fields that curiosity comes into play that's embodied, including science. Like I remember going to rooms at my first SFN and then just completely being thrilled by a room where I didn't understand anything anybody said. And you stood there for 30 minutes and all of a sudden you understood what was going on. So that was like a very thrilling experience. One thing I want to ask specifically is the distinction or relationships between exploration and curiosity. I think that the term exploration is used for even bacteria or very sort of low-level organisms, but curiosity is preserved for a little bit higher-level organisms. I wonder whether if there is some simple algorithm that's just randomly exploring. For instance, like there are some single cell organisms, they randomly explore until there is some sensing of food, and then they go towards the gradient that would increase that kind of whatever signal it is that they're receiving. Otherwise, they're going random. So I do, and in fact, in one of my favorite books that's usually here on the table, but right now it's not on the desk, it's over there, in sort of Other Minds. This is a book that I mention a lot on this Salon. There is a whole part where evolution is described in terms of how these kinds of search and exploration versus seeking something in a more gradient kind of way evolves over time in different species. At which point do you think it's no longer just exploration for, let's say, homeostasis, just physical sustaining myself, or can that also be curiosity? And at which point do you think it's kind of like in that gradient of exploration and curiosity, the two of them meet, or is there no distinction?
It's a really good question. And I think my ideas or my thoughts are still forming on that. I think that from the science perspective, there is frequently this distinguishing between exploration and exploitation. So we're walking around in some space, maybe it's random, maybe it's not, and then eventually we decide that there's something useful and do something about it. That deciding if there's something useful and doing something about it can be closer to creativity, I think. But I actually sometimes wonder whether this distinction is necessary or always useful. Part of me thinks that curiosity is the movement with the movement that is to move because moving is valuable in itself, and it's not moving for no reason, and it's not moving to acquire something. It's moving because moving is valuable. Or we gain some pleasure from moving. And I think that may be an important counterpoint to some of the other ways of thinking about it. And so I guess that brings me to the question of other animals. Are they moving purely at random with no sense of pleasure of the movement? Or is there something about the movement that matters to them? And I think that also, maybe I'll say that focus on the movement, and again, moving away from placing all of the value on what you get when you exploit or when you acquire, is that you can focus more on the patterns of movement. Like maybe I really like to move in a straight line, or maybe I really like to move in a curvy line. And it really doesn't matter where I start on Wikipedia or where I start in a book. My mind will always do the curvy line, or my mind will always do the spiral line. It really has nothing to do with the content that I'm exposed to. It has to do with the way I like to move in a space of concepts. I like to have concepts close by, but not too close by. I like to come back to ideas a certain frequency, or not come back to ideas with a certain frequency. And so it's really about the patterns of movement in an information space that is enjoyable to me, rather than what you get out of it, which I think pushes the exploitation idea aside a bit.
Yeah, and I would say also, at least from a philosophical perspective, one of the frustrations for me is the many times in which philosophers enjoy denying animals things that they think mark the specialness of a human. And curiosity is certainly one of those things. We get to have it, you don't get to have it. Hope is another one, which I find really ironic, that philosophers will deny animals hope. They don't have a capacity to hope. And I feel like part of the reason there's no hope currently is because of how humans behave on the planet for animals. So, but for me, what matters here is to think, what do we gain by drawing the line between higher organisms and lower organisms, the former as having curiosity and the latter as not? What do we gain by that, and what is it built on? What kind of commitments is it built on? If it's built on a particular form of anthropocentrism, with which there's a long history of in this particular case, then we need to really critically engage with that and decide if we can still hold on to the specialness of ourselves and our curiosity when we honestly grapple with the foundations of that tradition.
I think that's a great question, and I just want to add something to that. So in the recent years, in the past, I guess 5 years especially, curiosity is a term that has entered into machine learning very strongly, with a lot of algorithms called curiosity-driven exploration. And so there they distinguish a particular kind of exploration from just random exploration, which is curiosity-driven. And what do they mean by that? In case of exploration, I think that Dani said something that I found very key, which was that, and maybe I misunderstood, but what I wrote down was that there could be patterns of exploration that don't need to lead to some exploitation at some point. That was very important. Because if I'm just moving randomly to find some food source, at some point I'm going to exploit, like you were saying. So I'm seeking something, whether it's information or whether it's food. It's for the goal of that consumption. Maybe consumption is even a word I could use. But whether it's the octopus in my Octopus Teacher documentary, or whether it's humans kind of moving around in forests touching things, there seems to be a point where it's no longer about seeking some reward. And I think that that's perhaps the drawing line that I was making in my reinforcement learning oriented mind in terms of the equations that might happen. That it's not the case that in case of curiosity, one is necessarily seeking some reward. Maybe some folks talk about an intrinsic reward, so you give an added bonus to the agent. And there's a lot of different ideas of what the algorithms should be. So the initial curiosity-driven algorithm just followed things that were surprising. But that had a challenge, which was it got stuck in front of a TV because it would eternally be changing things, and it couldn't predict what was happening next. So it would get stuck in front of it. So then it becomes, it should be seeking surprising things, but also monitor over time that it changes your model of the world. So it needs to have some impact on my internal representations, right? I feel like someone like Foucault, or for instance, someone like, especially maybe not as much Foucault as much as maybe someone like, let's say Deleuze, or someone in the a little bit more sort of, I guess, rhizomatic, as in no structures, let's just everything be connected to everything, would be fine with the idea of curiosity leading you to get stuck in front of a TV. And I think like there was a movie, Videodrome, that's kind of related to this idea of how much people might go there. But then on the other hand, would you guys consider all of the forms of curiosity? I feel like that's a kind of a poetic curiosity that these machine learning agents had, where they got like stuck and they weren't doing anything useful anymore. I do wonder what you think of those kinds of formulations of curiosity and the way that they distinguish between exploration as kind of movements around in seeking rewards, whereas in the case of curiosity-driven exploration, it might just be towards surprising things or surprising things that change my model of the world.
Dani, you want to tackle that first?
I mean, yeah, I think that I guess the way that we're attempting to think about this is that there may be something valuable about laying down a connection between between ideas that isn't acquiring a new idea necessarily, and that there's also something rewarding about building certain structures of relationships that may be independent of what is actually acquired. And so I would definitely say that that is you know, what kinds of equations you would write down for that. Putting reward on the link that is made seems like one step that would be closer to what it is that we're thinking about. And yeah, I don't know, Perry, do you want to?
Yeah, I was also thinking of your that text you always bring up, the usefulness of useless knowledge, or
Oh yeah. Yeah. So that's Abraham Flexner's the usefulness of useless knowledge, which is a wonderful essay, just trying to underscore the importance of being curious for curiosity's sake, or asking whatever questions you want to ask, whether or not it will eventually lead to anything useful. It's really not about utility. It's only about the enjoyment of the passage of discovery. And I think that's kind of why we often use the phrase of walking or leaping when we talk about people moving through a space, because it's, why do you go hiking? Not everyone goes hiking to get to a particular spot. They go hiking because it's enjoyable to walk through the space, right? When we communicate with one another, we don't necessarily, sometimes we have a point and sometimes we don't have a point, but we enjoy walking through the space where there may be a point eventually. And so there's something important and wonderful about just the patterns of movement that are independent of acquiring, independent of exploiting, independent of creating. It's really the process that's enjoyable.
And I would also add that I think it's in a coming back to sort of critical theory lens, in a capitalist world, it's very difficult to know if I'm curious about something just because I'm interested in it or because it has a use value. I think there's so much saturation in what knowledge is for and what education is for, and how everything can be turned into a way of selling myself a little better on the internet or not. And so sometimes I think from a critical theory perspective, it's really hard to know if I am in touch with those things, those interests that perhaps nobody will ever know and nobody needs to know, and I have no compulsion for anybody to know. That I think that kind of interest and curiosity is, there's so little space. Part of it's the saturation of the work life as well, that so much of the time is taken up in things that can be turned into value or use. So I just think it's a tough thing to know if we're generating it, and what lifestyle would support more of that sort of Flexner approach to curiosity.
I mean, I want to ask Ida just on that one thing. I mean, talking about sort of the continental philosophers, I mean, there's a lot written, right, about play and curiosity and surplus jouissance. In other words, the surplus stuff, the stuff that spills over away from purpose, whether we go to surplus in Marxist notion of what goes beyond the actual value of the good. So there is a difference, it seems to me, between sort of curiosity being co-opted for the purposes of achieving a reward like a bacterium, versus this surplus joy, this extra that spills over, right? And Perry, wouldn't you agree that we're not so constrained by the neoliberal hell that we're living in that the jouissance has been sucked out of curiosity? Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, perhaps I'm a little bit too reflective for my own good, but I think, so walking, I think of my own like little projects that have been that extra surplus moment of curiosity, that I read these things because I just love them. I'm just interested in them. It doesn't matter. They always find a way into a paper. Always. I mean, so I read about bathrooms histories of bathrooms, constructions of bathroom plumbing, bathroom signage, bathroom roles and disability rights and trans rights and feminist rights and race segregation, just because it happens to be something I use the bathroom regularly and I was just interested in it. And so I read a lot about it. And then it became, I have things to say about this. I actually want to, so it comes back in. Or the same with walking. Like we've been reading walking books for a long time. Now I've got a walking book project, So I don't know if it's just my own tendencies, but I do find that most of what I fall in love with, I end up, or maybe it says something about my own work, that I like to work on things I love. And so there is, in fact, this meaningful circle for me. But
to amplify what John was saying, I think that the goal here was indeed to distinguish between curiosity or exploration out of necessity. Like I need to find food, and this is a scarce environment. So I need to become creative, curious, explore more, whatever the term is, which would be I'm swimming around, and it's 3 billion years ago. Life has just started on Earth. There's not a lot going on. Like I don't have a lot of sensors. I haven't evolved yet. There aren't other things that are producing something that I can just feed off of. So that time versus that kind of exploration versus the kind of idea of what you were describing, something that's not out of pure necessity of sustaining life or homeostasis. So that's the reason I was trying to see whether we would call that kind of early forms of exploration 3 billion years ago for life on Earth, we would call those also curiosity or not. And I mean, I'm not decided on that, but I do think that it might be interesting to see the kind of the evolution of curiosity over time, how it changed over time, if we want to think about it in terms of gradients. On that note, I wanted to ask, maybe this one is more towards Dani, given our common background in modeling groups of people as graphs, but also groups of things in the brain and neurons as graphs, and also states in the world and events in the world as graphs. It's kind of this obsession with it's all graphs all the way down. It's like turtles on turtles on turtles, basically. So I wonder, so I've had some work where the collective memory of clusters of people would converge faster and would sort of be more similar to one another if the weak ties between them talk first, as opposed to between the people that they are very closely kind of connected to each other. I think actually Dani was one of the reviewers of editor of one of our first papers on this collective memory work. So in some works we see that the shape of the network structure with which people are connected to each other can sort of make information blockage or bubbles in places, or it can allow information to sort of pass between different members. But in other work, we showed that if particular people who are weak ties, meaning they don't have a lot of friends in common, but they do have a tie between them, talk to each other early on, then the propagation of diversity of information in the network increases a lot. So one thing I wanted to ask Dani is whether there are some kinds of works that would be about the sort of the graph properties of curious minds in networks, and when they should be kind of activated in order to sort of optimize knowledge, discovery. And I guess in different times it would be different. If you want to discover, you want them to be active a lot. But I guess if you're in a pandemic, you want them to also be active a lot if you want to discover drugs. So I think I'm biased. I really like curious minds, but go on. You see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that there are two interesting distinctions that you're bringing up. One is between individual curiosity and collective curiosity, and are the same. What happens when you get a bunch of people that are curious in building their network structures kind of in different ways? And when you pile them all on top of one another, do you end up closing lots of gaps? So you have many fewer spindly sections. And then, in that collective aggregation of, small networks of knowledge, what are the new pieces that are most valued by our society? And so we do have one paper that's on arXiv where we study the growth of scientific knowledge in Wikipedia as evidence of collective curiosity. And we study the degree to which there are gaps in the network versus closed triangles in the network and how they came to be over time. and then, you know, which kinds of contributions are valued. And we find that Nobel Prizes are often those that are associated with gaps, either growing a new gap or filling in a gap, and that's rather than pressing at the boundaries of the bubble, which is interesting to us. So the ones that are pressing at the boundary of the bubble don't seem to get the Nobel Prizes. I'm going to question, you know, whether pressing the boundary of the bubble is maybe something that we should value more than we do. But so that's one question, the individual versus collective curiosity. What happens when you aggregate a bunch of smaller networks that have particular styles? And then the second distinction that I think that you called out is what happens when you have two systems on top of one another and you want to pass information from one to the other. How kind of aligned should those be so that you can pass information from here to here? Maybe it's one person to another, or maybe it's one collective to another collective, or maybe it's the humanities to the sciences, or maybe it's, you know, whatever it happens to be. And I think that asks questions of how do you take two network systems and align them so that there's maximal transition between the two? And what do we mean even by maximal transmission? Does that mean you get most of the information across, or you alter most of the nodes over here? Or does it mean you actually, one of the outliers on this layer can communicate with an outlier on that layer? And that kind of level of diverse transmission is going to require a very different kind of network and a different alignment of the networks to allow it to happen. So I think we can think about, you know, optimal fast transition of the big ideas, or we can, not big ideas, common ideas, or we can think about efficient transmission of the unusual ideas, or from questioners who are typically not valued. And that may require a very different structure that we need to build collectively. I think all of these are really neat questions, but require more thought.
Perry, did you want to add something? Or cool. So the last one is for Perry, and then I apologize. I spent so much time. I'm gonna wrap it up. Sorry, Joe. I'm wrapping it up very fast. So there is a negative side or a dark side to curiosity in colonialism, where some countries, this is again in the domain of, I guess, collective curiosity to some extent. So it's kind of related to the question that I asked Dani. So there would be an idea that, oh, I'm going to go discover other places and then treat the resources and the people in other continents or cultures as objects that can be now mine, and then I can exploit, I guess, and my culture can exploit. There's another downside to curiosity, and that's, for instance, Aline Coleman has this wonderful work about, again, network structures of society, and people who get sort of isolated are more likely to, or it's a correlation, so we don't know which way it goes, are also more likely to be the people who have conspiracy theories. So there is the kind of, I guess, imperialist, colonialist type of curiosity. That's one part of the dark side of curiosity. And another one is conspiracy theory, isolation, and I guess like that level of, so what, is there something I haven't, I'm not sure if you have addressed this, but what do you think about these two dark sides of curiosity?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that curiosity is complicated and that it is not purely an innocent enterprise in the way that it is most commonly talked about. So especially if any of us or any of our listeners start looking at whatever the description is of their organization or their university or their research program or something, curiosity is simply a good. It's simply this is a thing that marks us. We're curious, we're creative, and that's that. So I do think it's really important to continue to hold on to the complexity of curiosity and its, as you say, its dark side, or the ways in which it can be used violently, really, especially when we're talking about colonialism. I'm not sure I have a whole lot more to add, except that one of the things, I talked a little bit about curiosity formations in the talk right at the beginning. And I'm interested in analyzing in specific moments, so specific moments of empire or colonialism. We could be talking about 1800s, we could be talking about the Roman Empire way back when, but specific moments of empire in specific locations, geographies, and in relationship between cultures, how is curiosity practiced there? And I think there are differences, and attending to those differences matters immensely. But one of the patterns that is carries over for many of practices of colonial curiosity is, and we've talked about this, the practice of collecting the artifacts from a culture. So certainly there's a practice in colonialism of acquiring land and acquiring knowledge or erasing knowledge, doing a little bit of both, but also acquiring artifacts. And these artifacts end up composing what is understood, what is often called the curiosity cabinets, from the 16 into the 1800s. Curiosity cabinets. So this is a way that curiosity has been deeply thought in, historical studies of curiosity. And what does it mean that is, again, it's an understanding of curiosity as collecting, as acquiring, going back to Dani's slides as well. Maybe that structure of understanding curiosity as collection and acquisition needs to be changed precisely because of its colonial roots. And we need to think far more relationally and far more intimately about the practice of curiosity between spaces and between people and between ideas.
Thank you. Sorry I took so long. Jovo, go ahead. Thank you so much for answering this question.
Hi, everybody. How you guys doing? Thanks for putting up with all of our questions so far, and for probably putting up with more questions soon. So I just want to say first that it's so great to have you both here. We've really been looking forward to it. I think all of us for different reasons. One reason I've been looking forward to it is because I don't have a twin. I guess I'm in the minority here on the salon today, but I do get to work sometimes with my brother and with my father, and that work is both the most emotionally enjoyable and intellectually challenging work. And so I can imagine how great working with a twin would be. That's just really inspiring and exciting to me, just the idea of the possibility. So that's really cool for me. I guess the question I have for you in listening through all this is, I've studied neuroscience and machine learning and AI for a long time, and I never really think about curiosity. And so when I hear you talk, I think, sounds like you're saying I should, and or more of us should, maybe not me specifically, but the community should more. And I wonder, are you saying that? And then I guess the kind of flip side to that is, like, what if we don't? Like, how far do you think we can push our understanding of ourselves and neuroscience or learning and intelligence and AI if we don't study curiosity? Like, where will we hit a wall and be like, man, we really should have started curiosity because now we can't make any progress? Do you see what I'm saying?
I'm wondering, I mean, if we study learning, and how we learn how someone learns when we teach them, and how a artificial agent learns when we teach them, then we would miss all of the potential actions that somebody would take when they question what's being taught to them, or think that there's a new direction in which they're going to seek out the information themselves, apart from direct teaching. So that's maybe one place that would be an important separation. And maybe the second one that comes to mind, I mean, from a neuroscience perspective, is that there's a lot of work showing that motivation matters a lot for learning. And I think that curiosity is related to motivation in some important ways, that we are motivated to seek, and we can encourage others to be motivated to seek in particular ways. We can kind of model motivations to seek in particular ways, and that becomes important for not just understanding how learning might happen, but understanding how it can be optimized and how it can be encouraged and how it can be changed. I don't know, Perry?
Yeah, I would say that for me, for any of us who are doing inquisitive work, thinking reflectively about that inquisitive work is important, because there will be certain, I think, biases and certain ethical quandaries that come up in the work that we will not notice if we are not reflectively engaging in what inquisitiveness means and in what ways we can best practice it. So for me, thinking about why I'm asking these questions, how I'm asking these questions, and who I'm asking these questions with, that would matter to keep a field more diverse, keep a field more aware of the good and bad ways in which the knowledge that is being gained can be used, and also perhaps the costs of the social costs of how the knowledge is gained. So I think all of those things, I think this is something anyone who's asking questions, anyone who's doing research on anything should be thinking reflectively about their own curiosity, again, about what questions they're asking, how they're asking those questions, and with whom they're asking them, and what kind of purchase there are for those questions in the world and what might be happening down the line. It's just part of being an aware researcher, I think.
So thanks. That's a really helpful answer. So I wonder, like, to be concrete, would you advocate, like NeurIPS recently adopted a policy, there's an ethics statement required at the end of every paper. And like, if you write an NSF grant, you have to write a broader impact statement. Are you saying that every paper and every grant should have to have a paragraph that says, why are we curious about this? Or would you advocate for that?
Sorry. I would say no, not necessarily. I don't think the answers are always ought to be converted into policy. I think that when statements are required, oftentimes there'll simply be a loophole that someone does and doesn't really think about, and da-da-da-da-da. So that would not be my first angle. Yes, let's require this of everyone. Requirements in general, I think they have some uses, and I think they can't be our first start. They can't be the first step. I would rather think about how are we training scholars? How are we training researchers? What is the component of the curriculum that would actually give people practice with thinking through these questions so that it is ingrained in how I do my research from the get-go, rather than something I learn that I have to slap on at the end of it. That's my first response. Dani?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think that my mind immediately went to training as well, and thinking about how it is that we motivate everybody from the very young to the very old to not only be educated, but educate themselves about the kinds of questions that are around them and the kinds of questions that are not around them, and why, and how that might change the kinds of questions they want to ask in the future.
I mean, what's so fascinating about that is, some people would say that if you are trained in philosophy and the arts, that perhaps you're more likely to be meta about whatever you do. And I think what you're basically kind of saying is that it's really useful to sort of have a meta take on whatever you're doing. And I think what's interesting is that when you're worrying about grants and papers and impact factors, and that the meta side of oneself just evaporates, right? And I think it's really interesting. That's exactly, and to your question, Joe, but I just think asking at the moment, at least, to ask about an AI could be meta. I mean, oh my God. I mean, we haven't even, we've heard so beautifully today that, this is self-aware, it's system 2, the body is involved, So all those ingredients are just utterly missing at the moment, right? So from AI, so it's a long, big mountain to climb, right? But I think that the take-home message would be that it's useful to be meta about whatever you do, and that takes a certain education.
Okay, I hear that. So we're not into sticks, but what about carrots? So let's say Biden appoints the two of you to jointly head NIH. Now you have $1 billion this year to spend on whatever you want. How much should go to curiosity studies or curiosity education? I don't know how much is there now, but how much do you know, in terms of relative to other things? Because there's trade-offs. So where do you put this one?
Dani, I feel like I would assistant direct with you, NIH. So I would ask your opinion here.
You know, I guess I would say that I don't see curiosity research as something that is a discipline of its own. I think it sort of pervades everything. And the ways that we're thinking about questioning, the ways that we're thinking about how we question, what kinds of thoughts we have, what kind of ways we move through ideas is relevant for every discipline and for every area of science or not of science. So I guess I would not say, here's a bunch of money just for curiosity studies. I think I would want to think about whether there are ways of encouraging certain kinds of curious way making in whatever discipline somebody is in, right? And I think that this is exactly actually what Abraham Flexner was trying to do when he developed the Institute for Advanced Studies, right? This was a place that hopefully people could go to and never have to write grants anymore, and they could just do what it is they were most curious about. That's what he wanted that to be the thing, right? And so I think there need to be more places like the Institute for Advanced Studies, or more grants that are, tell us about what you're most excited about, and maybe it will never be useful, and maybe it's going to change the world, and that's okay. But then we also probably need some way of kind of evaluating those kinds of ideas, and I think that's where we as a community have fallen flat on our faces. How do we evaluate the proposals of, I'm just super excited about this? Maybe we need to get rid of some evaluations. Maybe we need to like really think outside the box for how to evaluate ideas. But I think that, yeah, I think that it has to be not siloing to a new subdiscipline. Curiosity is not a new subdiscipline. It's something that's much broader than that.
Cool. Okay, so the three of us have been hogging the two of you for quite some time now. So we're going to start inviting some other people as the first one just coming in. Oh, here's
our logic was just that there are two of you, so we can each spend twice as much time. Montreal.
Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, okay. So my question, because I'm still trying to figure out whether or not you think curiosity is something like qualitative or quantitative, but as it relates to what you guys were talking about earlier, learning, I was wondering how would you identify curiosity and learning? So within the participants, so like adaptation tasks is sort of a popular paradigm, and sometimes there's like explicit strategies that they're asked to develop. So does that, in your opinion, require some sort of curiosity about how to achieve this task or how to behave in a way, or is that purely like exploration in a more practical sense, I guess?
So when you're doing adaptation, does it require curiosity? Is that what you're asking?
Well, that's a good question, yeah. But also, so it said if it does, how would you capture it anyway? So does it? I guess.
Mm-hmm. So how would you measure curiosity in someone?
In a way, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that there can be adaptation that is not curious. So when I think about a typical neuroscience study of adaptation, it is perhaps where you show somebody a set of images, or you have them perform the same action over and over and over again, and then watch a representation be sort of crystallized, or you watch a behavior become more specific. But I wouldn't necessarily say that off the top of my head, it doesn't strike me as something that requires curiosity. So that leaves kind of the question of what would you do if you wanted to measure someone's curiosity? And I think what we did in the Wikipedia study is just to watch how humans walk through knowledge spaces and try to capture the different ways in which they walk. There are other studies that define or measure curiosity as the number of questions that somebody asks, or if they have bodily movements like raising their hand, and how many bodily movements like raising their hand the person has. I think that there are challenges in quantifying and measuring curiosity, particularly because many of them lie along a dimension of sort of curious, not curious. And as I tried to say in the slides at the end, what I think we both have a commitment to is ensuring that we quantify and capture the diverse ways in which people are curious without making such binary and hard judgments of this one's curious, this one's not, and having measurements that allow for diverse people who may not ask the questions, may not raise the hands, or may be, the victims of discrimination and bias and other things that make them quiet, even if they wouldn't be naturally. So those are important factors, I think.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that. Yeah. So that just like secondary reminds me of the question. So do you think it's more, curiosity would be more of a qualitative thing, right? Which is sort of this, so you could sit still and be nervous, but be very curious about, either a subject at hand or something not, right? And that sort of feeling inside, I guess, would be more curiosity than the sort of actionable steps you take to explore. Hopefully that makes sense.
That's a good question. Including mental actions, I guess. You have to take some action. It could be internal, right?
Yeah.
That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I think Perry, maybe because you were mentioning earlier about the difference between a feeling and a practice. Maybe that's the key here.
And Montreal, please mute yourself and others are talking.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add to that in particular. I think I'm less, for me, measuring curiosity is not a project. I think because of my particular background, so I do leave it to social scientists and scientists. But I am interested in characterizing curiosity. And for me, there's just been an immense frustration with just trying to get the right definition that encapsulates all of the things that curiosity is. And for me, that's a really limited approach to figuring out what curiosity is. I think defining is perhaps the humanities side of the measuring that the scientists do, and that's why I'm interested particularly in following practices, tracking practices of curiosity, because that opens up what we can see about curiosity rather than closing down and isolating.
And Montreal, just if I may, I think one of the really interesting things is that when people talk about theory in, continental philosophy or in the humanities versus theory in science, it is completely legitimate to talk about theory in the humanities, qualitative theory and verbal theory. And what can be difficult is how do you wed theory in its humanities sense, which isn't about necessarily mathematics or measurement, with theory in the scientific sense, and sort of what Dani does. And I think what's very exciting and gives a little bit of vertigo when we have discussions like this is how does one wed those two types of theory, which are equally legitimate, and get something new out of those two types of theory, right? And I think that's And curiosity seems like something that's amenable, by what we've learned from both of you today, to both kinds of theorizing, right? And that's very interesting, right? But sometimes it gets confusing because one wants to use a scientific notion of theory for a question that's more susceptible to a humanities form of theory and vice versa, and one needs to sort of unravel it, right? And I think that's what's going on here.
Yeah, that's great, and I get that. I get that. I asked because that's what I'm wondering. Where did they stand, right? Were they trying to bring this qualitative thing down to earth and give us some, measurements and learning, and you can, track this through these different states? Or were they looking for a more, logical, maybe explanation, intuitive even, I guess is the word Bergson would use, right? For these sort of qualitative experiences. But yeah, that answers my question. Thanks.
The answer is we're trying to do both. And we're trying to do it in as tightly an interdigitated way as possible, so that there's the fewest loopholes between the humanities theory and the science theory. That's challenging. That's why the dancer fell out, for example. But that means that there are opportunities in the future.
And Dani, would you say that even when there is no outward, maybe behavioral signature, there might be some neural signatures of curiosity? Because I guess another answer to Montreal's question would be maybe if there is no behavioral measures, but there could still be some neural measures. There should be something somewhere that's, it's a little bit like the beetle in the box for Wittgenstein. It's not like, there has to be, there should be some way that I can kind of understand your curiosity at some level, whether it's scanning the brain or.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think that's one of the things that's really beautiful about David Lyden-Staley's study is that, the extremely introverted and the extremely extroverted can sit in front of a computer and both browse. And it's not, it can be somebody who, has full access to their legs and somebody who doesn't have access to their legs. And it can be somebody who is, not privileged in other spaces, but in their home, they are, just themselves. And so it's a beautiful, safe place in which many kinds of people can explore and we can quantify and characterize very mathematically, right? The ways in which they're curious on a more consistent playing field.
Montreal, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
And your haircut got to debut on screen.
I'm going to leave.
Thanks for coming. It's nice to see you again.
Okay, so Mihai is next.
Yes. I just invited Mihai.
Awesome. So Mihai's question was the most voted one with 13 votes. We have discussed it a little bit before, so we should probably get into depth.
Hello.
Hey, Mihai.
Hi, thanks a lot for having me. I just love the salons. Every time I'm learning so much. So my question is about how do we think about curiosity in AI? And this has already been discussed a little bit, but so when we have robots or just AI, sometimes what we do is we try to build in some sort of curiosity mechanism so that it autonomously finds better solutions than we can build into it. And this very often comes up along with a discussion about safety. So should an AI be, or should a robot be curious about anything, about just like pushing that button or pulling that lever, or what might happen? And so I guess the question is, should we seek to build AI that is curious in sort of the same sense that humans are curious? And should AI be able to kind of ask any question? Should an AI even ask the question of what good is that supervisor over there? Or, what good are humans anyway?
Yeah, I think that the kind of, I'm maybe going back to what John said a little bit earlier, the kind of curiosity that I think AI could have right now is very different than the kind of curiosity that I think Perry and I have been discussing, in the sense that it is very embodied in the way that we're thinking about it. It is very much a practice that's kind of far from what you could perhaps currently provide to an artificial system. So I don't even know how to answer your question, because I think we're a little bit far away maybe from how I could think about that.
I might add though that we do think about. So I think that there's a preconception that curiosity should be unlimited, or that it is in humans, and I don't know if this is buried in your question, but that it's unlimited in humans, but it should be more constrained in AI. And part of what I'm pushing for is to think about how human curiosity ought to be formed. Also, is already formed and ought to be formed anew in certain ways, so that forming an AI curiosity in a particular way is consonant with this. So there's not so much as a divide of just a free curiosity among humans. They get to ask anything it is that they want. I mean, part of IRB is the insistence that, in fact, maybe that shouldn't be the case, but there are other things built in there. So just to break the contrast there a little bit between human curiosity and AI curiosity.
Yeah, and actually, I think that goes back to one of your earlier points, Perry, about how it's important to be curious in a way that is not acquisitional and objective, in the sense of potentially hurting a community, but being curious and that's when we talked about colonialization, I think. But to be curious in a connective way that is respectful and responsible to each person, or each item or each element that we are engaging with. And that could be individual to individual. It could be individual to animal. When I'm curious about an animal, I should treat that animal well. When I'm, and it's also true collectively. When one social institution works in a collective curiosity sense with another social institution, I think there are ethics involved all the way from the top to the bottom. And Perry, I think you're right that that's going to be true for AI too.
It's interesting that it might enter, Mihai, into the kind of domain of AI ethics in general. And it seems like this is not a thing that so we have weekly meetings in faith, fairness, transparency, and ethics in AI at Microsoft Research. And it's fantastic. We read all the time and discuss from people from various disciplines, anthropology, SES, etc. But I haven't heard sort of this concern, which is that what if the AI is too curious, like, you know, looking at some pictures of the moon and trying to discover something in it, and it forgets that it needed to feed the baby. I don't know. So I understand that could be like, there could be situations where if an AI's job is to do a particular thing, that might be a little different than, so if its objective is explicitly to do something that's critical for human life, that might be important. But I'm not sure if that's as much of a concern if the AI's job is to be curious, right? It could be that the objective is indeed that we set it to be curious. As long as we prevent harm from people, which we haven't right now, AI really harms people. Once we do remove harm from AI, there's no reason to worry that curiosity itself might harm. Or are you worried that it might like reach singularity?
So my point is more that, and this is along the lines of discussion that have already been put forward, you know, we have a sort of implicit limitations on what we're going to be curious about. And these may be because of our interactions and because of how society constrains us and all of that. And that might not be the case for AI. Things that we may just not think about being curious about because perhaps we understand implicitly that they are dangerous. Perhaps it's just, you know, whatever it is, that may not be the case for AI. And so in doing this exploration or just pushed by curiosity in order to find a better solution to the problem it's seeking to solve, it may perform unsafe actions. So the sort of thing that we think that implicitly should be avoided, the AI doesn't have the same sort of priors or the same sort of biases that prevent it from being unsafe.
Just one thing on that, if I may, is, when I think it was Dani that mentioned, showed Augustine and Aquinas and other, the notion of forbidden knowledge, and that knowledge should be forbidden, and that curiosity kills the human cat, has been around a very, very long time, right? And the Name of the Rose was all about that too. So in other words, one could argue that with the stuttering performance of AI now, we still are in the era where the curiosity that's doing all the harm is the human variant, right? And it's not like we're saying that Aquinas and Augustine were wrong. It's just they weren't completely right either, right?
So I'm thinking both in that sense, but also, say you have a cleaning robot that just tries to keep your house clean all the time, and then you buy a dog, and there's crap all over the place. One way of keeping the place tidy is you just kill the dog. So it's just by exploration and curiosity, right? So it is the sort of thing that we implicitly would say is just not something that you would be thinking about, but a robot might not have the same priors. Is this still part of curiosity, or is this an entirely different matter?
Well, just sounds like stupidity.
Is that not part of curiosity?
I think that this is interesting. It pushes us to ask, is curiosity value free? So I think there's an assumption that curiosity simply functions without values, right? You're simply trying to find a solution to a problem. There are no particular values, and one just acts, and this would be a solution to the problem. But I think that curiosity is always informed by values. So perhaps in that case, does the AI just have nothing that is valued more than another thing? There's some kind of, squashing the chair, squashing the carpet, squashing the dog are all the same. So there are values here, value quotients here, but they're all the same, and that's what results in a dead dog.
Or the values might just be mismatched.
Right. Or can you build value? And how and when would you build value? Because I think human educators think about this all the time. How do you build value that informs curiosity in a human?
Yeah, and that value structure can guide curiosity in beautiful ways, and it can also harm curiosity too. Yeah.
Wait, so I want to link this to what you just said, the idea of value-driven curiosity versus value-free curiosity that came up earlier in the conversation. I think about like maybe an hour ago or half an hour ago, we discussed this idea of whether curiosity is driven by some rewards or intrinsic rewards. I think now we were talking about external and internal value. Now we are thinking about maybe collective values. Do you think that curiosity is always sort of bound in some value structure, or can it sometimes be value-free or instituting new values?
I think that it is never value-free. I do think that it can institute new values. So it's led by particular values, and it can instantiate and change values, but it's not value-free. I think, and just when you think about how curiosity works, there is a certain attraction to a particular pathway, a particular question, and a sense of why that thing, why that way, why do I want to go that way? So I do think it's already embedded in values, personal and social and political.
Cool. Well, thanks, Mihai, for your question.
Thank you. That was
Thank
great.
Cheers.
And then we're bringing on flowers now. Great.
Otherwise, the chat is going to grow larger. And I'm gonna
No, exactly. I was going to say, you know, anything to sort of cut down on the tome that is beginning to appear in the chat box.
Not to cut down. Nobody's cutting down anything.
We're building it up.
Jonathan
John.
Jonathan should have been on earlier. Yeah.
Ali.
Hey. Say stuff.
Oh, yeah.
You're muted. You're muted, Jonathan.
Sorry, I was muted. So the question that I put in the question box relates to curiosity with regards to interest, whether or not we can be curious about something absent an interest in that thing. But I wanted to go back to this this point we brought up earlier about value-free curiosity. Insofar as curiosity, one, I agree, curiosity cannot be value-free. And two, the processes of inquiry that we use to resolve the initiating experience of our curiosity, right, are also not value-free, right? So how we resolve our curiosity and what methods we use to resolve our curiosity are emerge from within a social context that provides us with particular valued ways of, say, expressing curiosity, resolving curiosity, which gets back to your broader concerns about internal curiosity, the child who sits in the back of the classroom and does not say something, right? We view that child as disengaged because the social organization of how curiosity expressed does not value sitting quietly in the back of the classroom. It values raising one's hand and, say, striving to get attention, so on and so forth. And so I think this question of curiosity and value in a human social context, to be clear, is intimately bound together, because we cannot express curiosity without first understanding the social and cultural norms through which curiosity is expressed. And we cannot say someone is not curious without having a social and cultural background against which to compare their habits of being curious. So all this comes back to two questions. One, can you be curious without being interested in the thing we're curious about? And two, when we're talking about curiosity, are we talking about an initiating interaction with an environment that is then characterized through our social and cultural context, or are we talking about what Dewey would call the innate outreachings of an organism to secure something from its environment such that it can continue its characteristic patterns of action, right? So I would be curious about those two questions.
So I think that you can be curious without being interested in the particular content. I think that you can sort of randomly pick a book from the shelf and you can start reading it having no prior knowledge of the content of that book, and you can decide that the style of the writing is enjoyable, but it's not that the content area had any prior interest to you. So I think it is possible to be curious separately from being interested. And in fact, psychologists have separated out what they call interest-based curiosity, which is I'm curious about something for which I have an interest, and non-interest-based curiosity, which is that I'm curious, but it doesn't really matter what it is. And that's a little bit, not exactly the same, but it sort of recalls this distinction between the busybody and the hunter. The busybody doesn't really care what the news is as long as there's something. Whereas the hunter is searching for a particular piece of information, perhaps, or they could be. I think we think about the busybody and the hunter a little bit more broadly, so that the hunter could be searching in that linear way because they enjoy searching in a linear way, not necessarily because the content space of the search matters to them for some other reason. But then your second question, which was about, remind me.
the cultural organization of curiosity as expressed in humans, just basically, right? So is our understanding of curiosity ultimately grounded in the ways we're in nature through culture, or is curiosity, can curiosity simply be expressed as an organism's outreaching to an environment to resolve some gap between it and its environment?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, Perry, I'm really curious about your thoughts on this. I don't think that it has to be resolving something in its environment or with a particular purpose. I do think that our curiosity in general is something that is guided by social structures, though. So it's hard to imagine a person who could be curious without having been guided by educational practices from the time they were an infant to the time they're an adult, that would be kind of tuning the kinds of curiosity that they think they should value, and they think they should value in other people, and they think they should value in themselves. But Perry, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm sorry that my mic goes live very slowly, so there's a delay here. But what I want to think about is also, when I think about can curiosity be practiced, it's separate from interest. I want to think about I want to think about governments. I want to think about organizations. I want to think about police systems and ask, are they curious? And by that I mean, do they collect data? Do they pose a question to a particular environment and kind of circumference that environment, gain data from that, and make decisions and problem solve? And what does that even mean? So is a government curious? Is a police system curious? Is something like NIH curious? And if so, how? And where is the curiosity located? Because I think when we talk about interest, we think of it as located in a person. Do we need to start thinking about corporations? Do they have curiosities? What is that level of analysis of curiosity? And I think there's a benefit to saying, yeah, maybe curiosity is there, because then we can start talking about the collection, the information collection practices, and the respect for where the information is coming from and the relationships in which the information exists. We can start doing that work, which would create some accountability for these structures. But it's a weird thing to think about, that curiosity might be disembodied in that sense.
Oh, I definitely agree, right? I mean, to put my own cards on the table from a broadly Deweyan perspective, things like governments, corporations, things like that have interests. They engage in practices that we might otherwise call curious if we saw them executed by a single individual, right? And so I'm completely with you there. One of the things that I did want to kind of ask about, right, is insofar as our curiosity gives rise to our processes of inquiry, and insofar as we've been talking about curiosity as socially positioned, in that we're not, say, curious absent values, right? One of the tensions that we have in philosophy is folks who engage in just asking questions, right? Just asking questions, and the ways that these questions are framed are structured such that the asking of the question causes harm, right? The curiosity is in many senses weaponized. So what I wanted to ask was how your broad accounts of curiosity address this kind of an issue, right? Just asking questions as the weaponization of curiosity, or the weaponization of the processes that emerge from curiosity.
Yeah, so I would say what I want to hang out on there is the phrase "just curious." So I'm just asking, I'm just curious, and in a sense, that term is a disavowal of what's actually happening. I'm not just curious. I am invested. I am informed by a particular value structure, and some honesty about that, I think, would allow for questions to be formed, curbed, changed to a more relational structure. But that I'm just curious, I'm just asking, I'm just throwing this out there, I don't need to be accountable to how it hits you. That's a very that's a denying of what's actually happening, because as I like to say, questions happen between things. They don't just pop up, they happen between things and between people, and they function between us differently in different settings. And we need to understand that better in order for our question asking to be, I think, better done, let's just say. But Dani, I don't know.
There's a new book out on the philosophy of microaggressions. I'm forgetting the name of the philosopher. She's really great, you might know. And she makes exactly that point, that curiosity can be a very lame excuse for the weaponizing, as Jonathan says, of questions. And it's a very integral part of this book on the philosophy of microaggressions. It's very true.
So if I may, I just saw that Ivana Franke asked the question. Ivana is an artist with whom I collaborated in Berlin for years, and we've given talks together, had a book together, and she asked that I ask her question. And so one thing that we did with Ivana was this project called Seeing with Eyes Closed. And strobe lights is something that we borrowed from the Berlin University Hospital. And if you sit in front of a strobe light very close by with your eyes closed, and it starts to flicker between 5 and about 25 hertz, you start to see hallucinations, and there's some structure to it. So what we did is that we did it with artists, like in an artist gathering. We asked people to go to the room and do this and write what they experienced. Then we did some statistics on it, but we also wrote sort of something about the neuroscience, but the phenomenology of it was very interesting. Some people saw, very predictably V1 and then motion and then some temporal, inferior temporal lobe things. But some people saw very clear things. So at some point, I myself saw like a big mushroom cloud, like a kind of a, usually I would see like colors moving around, but then at some point I saw birds. So it wasn't clear when you would get what. So there was a very strange thing. And so that's why we wrote about seeing with eyes closed, because the art happens behind your closed eyes. So she's asking a question, and I just wanted to give this preface so you know that that's where she comes from. She builds art that's at the intersection of light and darkness, and you usually see something with it that is happening in your brain as opposed to necessarily in the material, and it's because of your movement around it or because of your perception. So the question that Ivana asked is, do you have data on subjective experiences of curiosity, on how does it feel like to be curious? You have related it to enjoyment and pleasure. On whose behalf? Is fear a factor in your view?
Oh. Yeah, are folks, can I jump in here? So one of the things that I would say is that I've been thinking a lot about curiosity as fueled by anger. So it's, yes, I can certainly understand that curiosity can also often be wrapped up in enjoyment, but for me, some very formative experiences of anger and frustration drove me to ask, how could this be otherwise? How could this be different? And I don't think these two are often thought together, curiosity and anger. It does kind of build into, I think, some of my work on curiosity and political resistance, although I haven't really fleshed it out. But when you ask about fear, I'm not sure about fear, but I certainly think anger can be a locus point for curiosity moving forward. Which is just, I don't know what to do with that, but it feels true.
If I might jump in here, right? So if we follow what Dewey says about problematic experiences, that the recognition of it is generally experienced as an affective sign of a break between an organism and its environment. And in humans, this sign is anything from pain to disorientation to anger, right? And so if we have a break with our broader environment, by which Dewey intends not just the natural environment, but our broader social environment, of course, anger and curiosity are intimately wed. I have an experience of social marginalization that upsets me, and I ask, how can this be otherwise? Or what do I need to do? How do I need to transact with my environment such that I can reorganize it so that this experience does not occur? And as you said, anger and curiosity wed together. The first place I went is Audre Lorde's The Use of Anger, right? Where she talks about anger as an initiating point for transformation, for social change. And she says that anger itself can be useful in this mode. In fact, she says everything which is useful can be useful, except for guilt, where, she says, I have no use for guilt, et cetera, right? So anger, I think, even the momentary frustrations that we have are initiating points of curiosity insofar as they push us to ask, how can this be different? How can I transform my environment so that I don't have to experience this, so that other people don't have to experience this? Or why do people want to set the environment up in this way? So yeah, intuitively I agree, and philosophically I definitely agree, right? I don't see how we can discount experiences of anger as not parts of our experiences of curiosity.
Something that I want to address fear here. I think something that's interesting about it is that, and it's linked with anger, because anger and fear are kind of sometimes close to each other, in that your first reaction to certain things might be a feeling of fear and gradually turns into anger. I think the transformation of fear to something else is where curiosity as a response to fear might be. And also for some people, fear is pleasurable. And so it might be that, a lot of people love horror movies. They just, I like some of them. I don't love it the way I don't understand why would you watch people dismembering each other, but okay. But a lot of people love it, absolutely love it. And some people really love to get scared. I used to love going to, ride the roller coaster when I was a kid, and I don't know why I enjoyed it. It was completely scary. Now I'm not sure if I would do it now, especially after a pandemic of being home the whole time. But there is a way in which that fear kind of resets things a little bit. Like things that really matter to you, if you really get scared, all of a sudden don't matter as much. Like pandemic hit, we all got super scared, and that fear really did something to me like that. I was like, I have to be myself now. I could die tomorrow. There's no point in pretending like I'm more straight than I am, or nicer than I am, or whatever. It's just or more in one line, or focused in one thing. I do different things, and I'm not going to hide it, and that's fine. So I do think that there is something to be said about fear that has not been adequately explored. I'm one of those people who transfers fear into something else too fast. Maybe I need to learn to sit with it. But I think maybe being curious about the fear is something that I haven't been courageous enough to do. And so this comment of Ivana makes me feel like maybe that's something to explore. But I can say when I'm afraid of some project failing, or something that Zena was mentioning in the chat, I go and do something else that I was before afraid of doing to procrastinate the fear of this one. So this kind of avoidance of fear leads to some kind of productive procrastination, where you didn't publish that paper in 6 months where you were supposed to, but within 1.5 years, you've published now 3 papers. So that's the difference. So for me, it kind of, which were as a response to the fear of the other one failing to some extent, or the response to the fear of the other one not being presented the way that you hoped or as cool as you wanted, right? So I think there's a lot to be said about being curious about fear and not just focusing on rewards. And we're not doing that in reinforcement learning, unfortunately. We're very focused on reinforcement and negative reinforcement, and there's no dimensions to this. It's not like various kinds of joy, various kinds of negative. So I like this some new work that we're doing, we're just taking a feature vector and we're not ascribing a reward to it, like the system has to figure it out. I think sometimes a fear response of the body is indeed like a push or a resetting or something. I think it relates to maybe Dani's work to some extent. It does some kind of circuit breaking sometimes in the brain, and the patterns maybe that you were very hooked on, you might let go of it because it seems like they didn't help me. How do I, they didn't help in this situation. So maybe in your mind sometimes you might be exploring or moving towards somewhere else, towards a place where it's not a fear, or a place where you can be in the same situation and not be afraid, or maybe seek the fear more just because it keeps resetting things and it keeps pushing everything that seemed so important aside. Sorry, I went on a sort of a long trajectory here because it activated a lot of the conversations I've had with Ivana, and I know she watches all of these sessions. I'm very excited that she asked that question, so I'm going to stop.
Do we have anyone else who might want to ask a question?
So Benjamin Pedigo was up next. He's got to run. I can ask for him. I know him pretty well because he's my PhD student, so I know what he's thinking.
Benjamin.
Pedigo asks, networks, if I understand your meaning, are inherently dyadic, i.e. representing relationships between two things. But it seems like a lot of relationships in knowledge space are polyadic. Some new ideas only make sense if you understand two or more other ideas first. Do you have any thoughts on how these higher order relationships between ideas fit into this framework?
Yeah, definitely, I agree. The dyadic representations that we used, particularly in the description of how people walk through Wikipedia, were a nice first simple pass. But we also have a lot of work in understanding polyadic structures, specifically using simplicial complexes and trying to understand those architectures. So when I was discussing how in collective curiosity we can identify gaps and how Nobel Prizes are associated with the formation or the closing of gaps, those gaps are actually holes that we detect using persistent homology, which is a tool that can be applied to simplicial complexes. So that's all the sort of science speak to say, yes, polyadic relationships definitely matter. And I think that they probably matter not just when we're thinking about bits of knowledge, but also when we are thinking about curious interactions among humans, which may not just be dyadic when they're in a collective or in an institution or among groups of institutions. So I would say all of the same ideas still hold. The mathematical machinery is a little different.
Perry, do you want to add anything to that? It'd be cool, Dani, if like the pursuit of science was all about changing the Betty numbers of our knowledge graph.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think that there are some suggestions that curiosity progresses us towards a compressible network architecture. Well, if you progress continually towards a compressible network architecture, you're progressing towards something that has no holes. And so that's definitely a change in the Betty curves. However, if you progress towards something that has no holes, that thing that you've built in your mind is a very small space, very filled in, a very small space, and not particularly flexible. So we're also thinking about what kinds of architectures do we build in our mind that are flexible, where we can say, oh, there's actually a connection between this tangential thing way out here in my knowledge space and this tangential thing way out here in my knowledge space. You would never be able to build that kind of connection by following compression. So I think you mentioned Betty numbers and the change in Betty numbers as a driver. It's actually very close to what people have suggested, but I think that there's more to it.
Cool. I really liked your answer to that because this whole discussion has been really interesting to me. I'm so in favor of what the two of you are advocating for in terms of, like, I think John said, consilience between the humanities and the sciences. And I remember reading C.P. Snow, like the two cultures 20 years ago, and being like, yeah, obviously that, right? We need that. And then also not having done it, but appreciating just how difficult it must be to transcend these cultural, ideological, intellectual boundaries, going from just two completely different languages and two cultures that have different values even, and trying to find something where both communities can appreciate it. And so I wonder, like, on the kind of spectrum of like fluffiness to concrete rigor theory, like, where do you feel like we are in this pursuit that the two of you have started?
I would just say that I'm not sure where it is that we are, and I actually like that. I like the dislocating function of this work. That's incredibly enjoyable and productive in different moments. But I would say that one of the places where we've met is through literature, which is odd because neither of us is trained in literature. So it's as if we needed a third language, a third field in which to actually meet and translate what it is that we do with one another. And we haven't talked at great length about that, but it's certainly apparent in the book. So we might, I don't know, I'd love to hear what you think about that, Dan.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that there is so much disciplinary jargon on both sides for us. And we have, almost a decade of education that was separate from each other. And so trying to come together and to find these places where we can make progress that's not, that is concrete in both fields has been difficult, but exciting. And you're right, that literature is a way in which we will each be reading a book and we'll say, the way that this person described this, Virginia Woolf, for example, I can see how that would translate into mathematics, and Perry can see how that connects to critical theory in philosophy. And then we can kind of, I think, yes, that makes it something that then we can bridge between the two disciplines.
It's a fascinating issue about literature being almost the universal general thinking solvent. Right, there's so much in literature, right, and it's just very interesting to see whether that can, like you guys are saying, it's so fascinating. Is this in your book that literature can act as the sort of pivot point to do these two types of theory, right? I mean, it's just so fascinating.
Maybe we should be doing it in Esperanto.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Well, because literature is so culturally bound with a specific language that,
Just learn multiple languages, man.
Yes.
But they were saying neither language is adequate. They needed a third language.
I don't know. I think very differently in Farsi, in English, in German, in French. I think I'm just different people in those languages. I genuinely think I'm a different person in those languages. And it's very frustrating because sometimes you need to access one in another one and you're like, oh no. Like, but one thing I wanted to say is that, so this kind of presence of philosophy, science, literature, arts in one individual, this kind of polymath idea. This is the pre-modern model of Iranian Persian sort of scientists. And many of them have left books of poetry behind, which is how we know they were actually Iranian, because they had to write Arabic. It was the language of the time. This is pre-Renaissance. This is the time that it's Dark Ages in Europe. The church has said Arabic numbers are the devil, and there is nobody's allowed to use zero. The term cipher, by the way, comes from saf, which means zero in Arabic and Farsi. And the term cipher and decipher is that they pretended like they're writing Roman numbers, and then they would decipher it because it wasn't easy to do addition and subtraction. And that term itself has an interesting history. Sorry about this diversion, but like on the sort of the Silk Road, they had these sand sort of plates, and then they would put pebbles on it for trade because they didn't speak the same language, in fact. So that was the Esperanto of trade, Jovo. And when somebody tried to take a pebble, like to trick others, there would be a hole. That was an absence that marked that there was a presence there. And that's how this notion of the nothingness that exists, the notion of self sort of came to being. And it was interesting that along this kind of the Silk Road thing, and then the various kings providing money to individuals to do things, what happened was that doing poetry, and then translating sort of lost philosophy books from the Greeks, because Alexander had attacked Persia at some point and had occupied, so all the philosophy had migrated with him, and within 2 generations they had adopted the Farsi languages and they were out. So it was like they were there for 100 to 100 years, and there was a lot of exchange, but then they got intermarried with the status quo, and then they stopped. So, but then that brought in a lot of philosophy, which was then again transferred back to Europe after the Dark Ages. So this kind of strange cultural sort of curiosities, Persepolis, which is in the sort of the center of Iran, one of the 2,500-year-old thing. People from various places were invited to build the place. So we can't really claim that those architectures are Persian, because actually people from various places were invited to build that. So when you see similarity between there and somewhere else, it's not possible to claim it, right? John, we can hear you.
That was the most...
John, we can hear you.
I got it.
Thank you for muting, John. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is, there should be some kind of historical cultural curiosity too. We should go back and revive things that got lost for various reasons. In terms of network science, I think, Dani might find this interesting, why that sort of tradition died. These polymaths were all relying on kings funding them. There was no institution that they were there, and regardless of who was in charge, they had like some resources in order to continue this. Why was that? Because in the religious institutions, things were too rigid. These polymaths were people who were writing poetry about like not believing in God. They were atheists. They were like, they were usually like, sexually deviant. They didn't fit in a lot of norms. They would have been sort of killed for various reasons. Some of them did get killed. Some of them committed suicide before they got caught because they didn't want to be like, reach bad sort of treatment. So it's interesting to me that they were kind of the resistance of a certain type of curiosity over various times without any institutional support, at the mercy of whatever king would give them some funding, right? It's very interesting to me, that kind of nomadic, super curious, non-conforming, kind of crazy, kind of genius, bridging sciences and arts from various places. That kind of thing is no longer valued for some reason. Usually these kinds of, you have to either conform to some level or you're sort of kicked out. What do you think would be the way to bring this back, to revive these kinds of traditions? Because in spite of the fact that I was in an interdisciplinary PhD program, I gotta admit, it wasn't as great as I expected it to be, and it doesn't sustain, because afterwards when you come out, it's harder to sustain that kind of interdisciplinarity. What do you think would be possible, not just for this kind of to be in this world, which is the Western world, but to also be curious about the forms of this kind of curious polymath existence in the history of various places? I'm sure, I know about Iran more than other places. I'm sure they've been everywhere. But how do you think we can kind of be historically curious, not just about the future, but also about the traditions of the past for curiosity?
One of the things, I don't have an answer to that, and so I'm hoping that Dani is generating one. But I do want to say that it's interesting that you point out that they were funded by kings, and that is precisely the source of the vulnerability of their livelihood and of their contributions. But I want to add to that another sort of history, which would be specifically fugitive slave communities in the U.S. South, and the ways in which story and science, there's a fantastic book that just came out called Fugitive Science, are being, and artistry and song and music and all of these things, dreaming and political theory, are happening in this space well outside of any safe, any funded place. And I think there's a long trajectory of those histories as well, the thinking outside of the spaces that are supported, and so perhaps we could think these two histories together: the ones that are funded but are super polymathic and could have been and were leading certain things, but also the ones that continually get forgotten and in fact were never recognized at the time, and hold these together. But Dani?
Yeah, I have two quick thoughts, which are that I think that it's difficult to convince somebody to spend the time to become a polymath when each discipline themselves does not value the ways of thinking of the other. And so it becomes sure that one person in their own head will love the connections, but it's not something that is often valued for tenure or valued for that person's field. It's as if the only methods of inquiry that are valued are the ones that are kind of very central to that field, not even kind of a little bit off center, but like super central. And I think that's what we need to address before we can ask or motivate people to bridge fields earlier in their careers, I think. Yeah, so I think that that's important. The second thing is that one example of a person who did not have somebody funding them is actually Maria Sibylla Merian, who is the person that I mentioned in the beginning slide deck who wrote the Caterpillar book. And the people who were typically funded to do naturalistic work, natural philosophy, science at that particular time were typically men, always men, and were often funded by the government and have positions to do this by the government. And she was a person who just said, I'm going to do this because I love it, and did it, but ended up having to do a lot more of it herself. So she wrote the book, she did all of the experiments, she drew all the pictures, she did all the etchings, she was involved in the actual publication of the books. So it was, I think that these people who are on the outskirts end up being required to do so much more to produce the piece of work that again may not actually go recognized for a very long period of time. So I think we should just be aware of that, I guess, as we consider all of those voices around us who are not asking the questions that are in the common stream, but are asking questions that are farther out.
I wanted to. Did you? Oh, okay. So I wanted to hop in here and say this is kind of a problem of interdisciplinarity insofar as the ways that it's valued within the academy. But I also wanted to kind of dovetail on Perry's point and point out like some of the earliest work done on the sociology and statistics of racism is done by Black folks who are unfunded. And I'm thinking here of Ida B. Wells Barnett, right? And Du Bois, but I'm also
sorry, I got a medical call. I promise. Ugh, very unexpected. Didn't mean to be rude.
Okay.
Flowers was talking.
But so I'm also thinking about this in terms of again, in terms of my background in East Asian philosophy and in terms of my background in American pragmatism. And one of the things that comes out of both traditions is the understanding that literature or aesthetic works, due to their affective power, their abilities to move us, can bridge otherwise diverse fields or otherwise diverse spaces of experience, right? So a work of literature might be the way to divide, say, the humanities versus STEM conception, so on and so forth. But to go off of something that Ida said, I think part of this this issue is language, right? And so Ida was talking about Farsi. In Japanese, there are words for experiences that you need whole sentences in English to express. And I think when we're talking about things like curiosity, when we're talking about the broad contributions of this kind of interdisciplinary work, I think the fact that our language restricts us to providing conceptions and understandings of particular kinds of experiences, ways of experiencing, ways of being curious, ways of inquiring, ultimately serves as yet another kind of a barrier to the kind of work we're talking about, right? So, and to give a brief example, right, when we're, every time we've talked about curiosity, I thought about translating it into Japanese. And the way that I would say that is, Kiyomi ga aru, do you have an interest in this, right? Or do you have a sense of being interested, an affective pull towards it, right? As opposed to, are you curious about it, right? Because curiosity and interest in these contexts are wedded intimately together, which motivated some of my earlier questions. And so insofar, if we think about, say, interest and curiosity as conjoined, right, affectively conjoined, we have a whole new way of considering what we're talking about when we talk about, say, the curiosity of animals or artificial intelligence or humans and so on and so forth. So to bring this all back together, I really think when we're looking at the ways that something like literature bridges disparate fields, we also need to consider language here, right? Because literature does something else with the materials common to all of our fields, language, that are to make something new. And other languages do other things, right? And so I think some of that needs to be thought of here when we're talking about this.
Walter Benjamin, right, in his wonderful essay, The Task of the Translator, gets exactly to what you're saying, Jonathan, is that he feels that there's this very interesting thing that you, on the one hand, you have to accept that there's a Babel of languages, but on the other hand, if it's literature, you should be able to, through the task of the translator, extract something universal, right? Because it's so important. And it's extremely, and then of course, there's a whole field of translation studies, right? But it gets at that. I mean, I think we could do a huge job here with the Salon with, Dani and Perry, if we could actually bring back literature as the sort of thinking glue for all these disciplines. It would be wonderful. Because it's certainly not happening right now, right? I mean, and also at Penn, it seems to me, right, that there seems to be more of an interest in doing this. Is that right, Dani? Sort of like these multidisciplinary projects?
I think that the Mind Core group is definitely bridging linguistics, philosophy, cognitive science, and neuroscience. So they are bringing together people who can speak across those spaces. I think one of the big challenges in bridging literature and the sciences is partly related to what Jonathan Flowers just said, which is that literature often is thought of as something that has a deep affective nature, impacting our feelings, and science is typically thought of as something that is purely rational without feelings. And so there's a big divide, I think, in the historic ways that people have thought about the two disciplines and whether or not it's okay for them to be communicating with one another, or whether any contact with literature would make science less rational, for example. I am not a proponent of that idea, but I think that is something that comes across in the communities that are engaged here. So that's challenging.
I think science fiction might be an important kind of bridge here, maybe, because a lot of the scientific advances that happened in the 20th century had been already in a famous science fiction. From going to the moon, where actually there is there's sometimes astronauts that come and talk at Microsoft, and they're like, oh yeah, so I I was inspired by science fiction and this music, and then one of the astronauts at the end played Ground Control to Major Tom on his guitar for us on screen, so that was exciting. There is a lot of so the things that make people curious about a certain domain sometimes is indeed in literature, and it's strange because we use affective techniques when we write a scientific paper. No scientific paper is free of affect. Like some of them are actually, you can see you can read the bitterness. I'm like, oh, some of them, the way that they're talking about another paper, or when a reviewer writes you, or when you respond to a reviewer, you see sometimes passive aggressiveness, you see sometimes actual aggression. There's so many feelings. There's joy. There is like, I'm so excited you published this, or you wrote this. I'm excited about you publishing this. My favorite was one of the reviewers who said, you're underselling the work. Add a paragraph about this so that people can see that this. It was just like, there's so many different affective interaction that we have that is exclusively in writing. which is very different. When I sometimes meet some scientists at a conference, I'm just surprised in a face-to-face interaction because it's a completely different person than the written person. So I think maybe in two domains we could get close, we could bring like literature closer. One is to reflect on the different ways that we are writing, like the same scientific paper, if it was written in 3 different styles, like even when we write for different journals, for one it's longer, for one it's shorter, the choices that we make, there is a lot going on in there, and none of us is really trained in a literary theory about any of that. And I think at some point, like, you know, in a couple of 100 years where scientific publishing has a different format, people are going to historically look at this as literature. They're going to look at what we're doing.
Well, I'm not so, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things about literature, it's not just writing. I mean, most scientific papers are so far from being literature, it's not even funny. They're the driest, most tedious, most... So in other words, it's interesting that there was a time when scientists, and now we've just seen this now with Perry and Dani, have written a book. Most scientists never write a book, right? It's a very, very, very few scientists ever write a book. It's these awful little papers, these little salamis of minimum content, right? In other words, it may well be that if we had literature come back, that we'd have more of these collaborations where, you know, people actually write books, because I think that literature is something that emerges from something that's actually a little bit longer. It's got more layers. Would you agree that it's you know, there are short stories, but I think it's about the book here. I mean, you guys wrote a book, right? You wrote papers too. And I'm assuming that you felt there was something extra from writing a book. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I would just I just want to prompt Dani to talk a little bit about the Royal Society papers that we discovered back in the sort of 1600s versions, and the kind of origins of science in a less pure sense.
Yeah, sure. So I would definitely say that writing a book is extra compared to a scientific paper, partly because you have so much freedom. You have so much freedom to explain your ideas in ways that are not channeled according to the methods of questioning or the strategies of questioning that are acknowledged by a small discipline. But yes, wonderfully, the proceedings of the Royal Academy of the Sciences are on line. So the Proceedings of the Royal Society, are online from the 1600s. So you can go onto their website and you can look at the papers from the 1600s. It's beautiful. And, you know, they are not necessarily, many of them are not dry. They are, I discovered a monstrous calf in the field today, and this is what it looked like. Or a doctor cut my friend's vein and milk came out. And this is a very strange observation, so I think we should tell the world. This is very unusual. And it's interesting. They are not particularly organized. There isn't as much, you know, shared value structure about what kinds of stories count as stories versus count as science. Science is the telling of stories, the telling of observations, and there's a sense in which all observations are worth telling, which I think is really important. And I think that more science should be about the fact that all observations are worth telling. That's different from telling it in a very literary way. There are some senses in which some of these pieces feel like a bit of literature, but they're not as deep as I think what John is mentioning.
Yeah, the history of the monograph.
Sorry,
yeah.
but I don't agree that only books count as literary artifacts. So it's true that books are an important form of literature, but I would disagree that only books are literary artifacts. I mean, the Pulitzer Prize for Literature was won by, you know, Kendrick Lamar, and that's not because it was a book, right? It was rap lyrics. I think the notion of literature is more fluid than that. And I would definitely think, in spite of the fact that, let's say, for instance, one of my favorites, so Tolman has written books as well. In fact, one of his books is called Drives Towards War. So it has nothing to do with his rodent experiments, just like ideas about war and everything else. If you read even his scientific papers, they're much more sort of literary than a lot of the other scientific papers that you might read. So I do think that there is literary style even in scientific paper writing. I wouldn't necessarily think that literature is only reserved for books. But I guess John has...
No, just to clarify on that, of course you're right. I mean, I think it's absolutely wonderful. It's absolutely true that when you go back and look at those original papers and then the birth of the monograph, they had much more narrative in them. Oh, I really messed up with that experiment. I shouldn't have killed that animal. I mean, there's a lot more which you wouldn't even dream of putting in a scientific paper today. So what I would say is that, of course, you're right that you can have the literary in a piece of text that isn't a novel or a book. But what I would say is today in 2021, if you want to get that back, you're probably going to have to write a book, because you're certainly not going to be allowed to do it in the ever smaller, rigid formats of papers. So that's all I would say, is that there was a time when there was more leeway and there was a more blurred boundary. But now, if you want to do some of that, I think you have to write a book. And I think that's what you meant, right, Dani, when you said it's extra, 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 right?
Yeah, I won't tell you how many reviewers have asked me to take out the literary aspects of my papers. It's very, it's not well accepted currently. So yes, you get the freedom when you write something else.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I did want to hop in here and say that that philosophy broadly, there's a great number of philosophers who push back against the notion that there is nothing aesthetic or nothing affective in science, and that to introduce the qualitative into science would be to wreck it, right? John Dewey famously, says that artistic thought is not unique in its affective or aesthetic or qualitative nature, right? Scientific thought involves its own kinds of qualitative controls, its own kinds of stylization that results in our ability to say this thing is scientific, right? And the only reason we think otherwise is because, folks are so concerned with their mastery of the formal structures of science that they miss the broader qualitative the broader qualitative elements that go into any really good science, the initiating moments of wonder or awe or so on and so forth that drive inquiry. And on the other side, right, we have the concentration of those things that we call aesthetic or art into a few select forms, which gets us to Ida's point that literature is not just books, right? In fact, literature for much of human history wasn't books. It was poetry, right? It was poetry, it was song, it was oral storytelling, it was dance, it was drama. It's only in modernity that we have this really narrow conception of both science and literature and the nature of the qualitative, aspects of these things. And so I think this goes back to something we said earlier, that we've forgotten the stuff we did in the past, and it to our detriment, right? So.
Yeah, and I would also add, I would add philosophy here to the mix, and there were some comments on the side that capture this a little bit, but the sort of analytic continental divide is appropriate to bring up here because there's a kind of philosophy that tries to model itself upon the sciences expressly, and then there's another kind that is far more friendly to a literary approach to both writing and to thinking, and a poetic approach to thought. But especially here, specifically here in the US, right, the more analytic or science form is much more highly celebrated and has higher standing than the more poetic one, as if granting any kind of a literary quality to thinking itself is to weaken, again, as sort of what Dani was saying about the sciences, to weaken the thought. Because both science and philosophy aim at some kind of rational illusion of the mind divorced from affective and embodied life.
Of course, the irony about all this is if you look at, very interesting work on the philosophy of mathematics, for example, and the whole notion of intuition and how people get to things, there's this pre-formal component of intuitive thought that happens even in mathematics. There are whole books written on this, right? So it is actually not true on its face, actually, when you start to look at what's happening when people think about any topic, right? There's this intuitive pre-theoretical mode that you go into. Who knows what one brings into that? It could be, oh, I'm looking forward to having a donut this morning, and it helps you think about what you're doing. So in other words, it's absolutely right what Jonathan is saying, is that this idea that there are these two totally different modes of thought, and I think it's the admission that they're not that different that forces these rigid, this is how you have to write a scientific paper, because God forbid that you infiltrate with your other parts of your brain, right? It's fascinating. It's fascinating stuff. Well, listen, look, it is 8 minutes to 7. I think this may be the longest session ever, but we had two people.
Oh no, we've run over 7.
Have we? Okay, yes. Right, but it's wonderful. Is there anyone else?
There are a lot of questions that people asked us to ask for them, but like I have to ask, first of all, how are our guests doing? Because I know Dani has kids, so like I'm guessing at some point.
They're out at the moment. I'm flexible to do whatever everyone else wants to do.
I think maybe just to be fair to the people who asked to be asked for them, and not only prioritize people who have the courage of being on screen. Amir has the current most highly voted question. Can we say an amoeba is curious when moving around? If yes or no, what is the most primitive form of curiosity? Similar to something we've discussed, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a really good answer to that right now. I think the way that we are thinking about curiosity and animal species is really about which ones can help us to understand the ways in which we might be curious, the different ways in which we might act in our environments in a curious way. And I think, maybe we'll have more to say after the bestiary comes out, but I think that at the moment, I'm looking at the animals as ways of understanding myself, rather than of defining whether or not they are curious. But Perry, what do you think?
Yeah, I would reiterate something I said a little bit earlier, which is that I'm interested in what would drive the drawing of a line wherever it is drawn for curiosity. What would drive that line, and what would justify that line, and what kind of histories of thinking about lines between not just humans and animals, but animacy and inanimacy. What kind of commitments we have to what things are animate and what things are inanimate, or have less animacy than another thing. And I would want to look at what those commitments are, and do they deserve a second look? That's what I'm interested in.
Perry, I think that last thing you said is so interesting, because there's this story in the Bible with Moses strikes a rock. And like, you might think that's not such a big deal. Like, it's a rock, it's inanimate, but it is a huge deal, right? He suffers terribly because of that. We don't need to go into details or anything, but it's a really early example of people noticing that we can care about like the feelings, so to speak, of inanimate objects, and it's worth thinking about. And I remember learning about that very early on and thinking, whoa, like, maybe I shouldn't strike rocks. Like, I didn't know that would be bad, but I should at least think about whether it's bad.
In Japanese philosophy, we have something incredibly similar, right? The kokoro, right? The heart mind is a property of affective, cognitive engagement with an environment. And it's not limited to humans. In fact, for most Shinto philosophers and Buddhist philosophers broadly, anything that could inspire awe or an affective response in us had a kokoro, and because it had a kokoro, it was capable of feeling, right? And so whole bases of practice developed around aligning one's kokoro with the kokoro of an object, right? And so Dogen famously says, if you doubt the walking of mountains and rivers, then you don't know your own walking, right? Because you don't understand the nature of how you're moving through the world. And I mean, we see this in modernity in Mazda's Jinba Itai design, where they seek to actually design a car that bridges the gap between self and objects such that you can drive better. But so to give a non-Western example of how this kind of curiosity, this kind of understanding that non-human agents can be curious works, anything with a kokoro in Japanese philosophy can be curious. A rock has a form of curiosity. How it's expressed, I don't know. But because it has a kokoro, because it can inspire us to feel something, we should probably treat it as if we would treat another moving, evident or moving clearly intelligible organism. So yeah, I mean, I generally agree. I would say the amoeba, even for Dewey, the amoeba is curious. It's not curious in the same way as humans, but it is still curious.
I think that's the interesting part. And I think that's the Foucaultian answer that Terry gave us, that he's interested in what are the criteria based on which we would draw that line. But that, oh, this is like human curiosity, this is not like human curiosity, right? This is playful, this is just for necessity. These kinds of lines and the reasons for that. I agree that that's important. The next highly voted question is also by Amir. And he asks, how can one decide a question is a good one? Especially in science, is there a way to evaluate a question and decide it's worth one's time and resources? Could the science of curiosity address such questions?
I might begin just by saying I think all of my best questions were bad ones first. And that may be true in general of good questions, that they're bad first. That they're a little bit lacking in care, that they're a little bit of a shot in the dark, a little smushing together of two things that may or may not belong, a sort of hunch that, I don't know, I liked this thing about this text and this thing about this text. I wonder if they would go together and how would they go together. So I'm actually wondering when is it that we need to ask if it's a good question or not? And why would we ask that? I don't know. I guess for me, I don't want to jump immediately to cutting off, oh, this is a bad question, because they are always bad questions. But it's actually in loving these bad questions that some of the most exciting projects I've had have come from those, as opposed to the things that I recognize most immediately as a good question. Oh, that would make for a good paper, because that fits perfectly into like what this person says and this person says, and there's a tiny slot in between, and you can just make this connection. And those are the boring ones. Those are the ones that just like take forever to write, and they just feel soulless. I don't know. Dani, what do you think? Good, bad questions?
Yeah, I think you do have to be careful in defining good and bad questions for yourself, in making sure that you don't define good and bad questions for other people, right? I think one of the things that we've been discussing throughout the last 2 hours or something is the point that different people may have different questions they want to ask and need to ask, and the questions are asking to be asked. I mean, as Virginia Woolf says in the Why essay, the questions are asking to be asked, and they want to be asked in a safe place. The questions are inside of us, and we don't need to be putting a value to each of them. I think we need to be giving them air by venting them to the world, and all of us may have different vents, and different things come out of the vents, and that, I think that's a world in which we want to live, when all of that's okay. Yeah, I also agree that sometimes I don't know. Yeah, I think I love rabbit trails that don't seem like they may be going anywhere. Often they don't go anywhere, but sometimes you just have something interesting to say over the dinner table. That's okay.
I think just using the term "good questions" might be already putting the value before the value before the horse kind of situation. I think that it again comes back to what I think the question that Ivana was bringing up. Sometimes it's just fear. Sometimes it's disgust. It's like, what is this question? Or sometimes it's anger. It's like, how dare you ask me that? Or sometimes it's that's obvious, or this is boring. But then you're like, maybe no. And then gradually your relationship to it changes. It's like the first time I had wasabi, I was like, what is this? What is happening to me right now? I don't know. I think I really like the answer that why do we need to say good to begin with. The next,
and also just one thing, sorry, Ida, just one thing to get back. I mean, because I really like Jonathan and mentioning Dewey. I do think it's really important, and there was a book that I will try and remember about the birth of the scientific method in the United States, which was explicitly to be non-literary, right? And it didn't come from the scientists. It came from commercial entities and popular science magazines. Okay, so there's a deep, sad irony that the taking on of the scientific method, and Flexner was mentioned. I mean, Flexner was a little bit guilty of this too, wanting to sort of at least have some sense of the scientific method. But there's, I will try and post it in a minute when I stop going on, but it is important to realize that the sucking out of the literary from the scientific came from commercial and intermediate business interests as much as it did from scientists. Okay, and the last point about C.P. Snow, I mean, C.P. Snow keeps coming up, but C.P. Snow was not really any great hero. C.P. Snow actually was bashing a little bit on literary people for not knowing enough science, claiming that scientists knew who Shakespeare was, but literary people didn't know the second law of thermodynamics. So it was very much science snobbery a little bit from C.P. Snow, rather than the kind of ecumenical position that I hope we're all adhering to right now. But I will find that book, because I think you'd find it actually, both of you, very, very interesting. The ironies multiply. Yeah.
I'd like to throw in here, just as a brief aside, it's not whether a question, I mean, when we think about good or bad questions, and I agree with Ida, we're putting the cart before the horse, right? We're thinking about this wrong way. It's what curiosity motivates the question. What context allows one's curiosity to be expressed in the form of this question that has X effects in our like community of inquiry, right? And we've talked a little bit about this with the weaponization of curiosity, so on and so forth. But I think when we talk about this in a pedagogical context, it's not, does a student ask a bad question? Does a colleague ask a bad question? But what context results in the expression of your curiosity in the form of this question that has all of these effects, right? And so in my own pedagogical practice, when a student asks me a bad question, I never ask anything about, I never say the question is bad. I ask them, why are you asking this question? What motivates this question? Why, that kind of thing. And I think we need more of that in our practices instead of normative judgments about the qualities of questions. Now, granted, there are some questions that are pretty terrible, but they're terrible because of the effects they have.
Just want to bring that back. Dani and Perry mentioned earlier at some point is how this is all related to education and how we train people in the next generation. And just, there's a lot of discussion. I have 2 little kids, so I read a lot about how we're supposed to do stuff now, and everyone has different opinions, but there's a strong ideology now that we shouldn't say good question, because what about all the other questions? Were they not good? And it's so closely related to what you were saying. Like, they're all good, or maybe not, but who knows? And it's complicated.
Some are great.
Some are great. Yours are great, Ida.
No, but that's the thing. Like, some questions are good question, great question. With kids, I guess, like we have to nudge them. Like, there's no, like, they shouldn't think it's okay to put their hand in fire. It says a person with no kids. I'm sorry.
Actually, Jonathan, to your question in the chat, I would say that if anything, science, once you strip away tech and data and all the things that are used to do science, I actually think that the deep, dark secret is science as a humanity.
I like that secret. I'm going to share it.
Yeah, can we quote you on that one?
Of course.
What does it mean?
John, can you say it again for the people in the back?
I'm saying that once you start talking about the way we have here, the proceedings of the Royal Society at the end of the 17th century, sort of the injection of narrative, bringing affect in, having this pre-mathematical intuitive thinking that comes before even a mathematical equation. Once you start doing all of that, I think it begins to look more like literature and history. And I think that when we talk about method and engineering, I think that's when we actually try and strip that down. But I think that imaginative scientific thought is much more like the humanities than we admit. And I think that I don't think that it's technology. I think I think that's what we're really going to find out in the end, and I think that's why we should go from STEM to STEAM, like I hope we are. And this wonderful effort from Perry and Dani, I think, is to push in that direction. I mean, that's what I hope, anyway.
I also think there's a really interesting challenge to ourselves as we think as scientists of incorporating being willing to think a little bit differently and not necessarily within the mainstream of methods. And I think it's related to our willingness to engage in intellectual humility. I think that as if we focus on the scientific method in the way it is as, structured and purely rational, not effective, we think that we can get to something that is definitively true and therefore could never be wrong. And it allows us to think, well, maybe we don't need to have intellectual humility. It's as if we're so objective that there's no such thing. And then once we allow ourselves to realize the subjectivity of all human thought, we are scientists, we are not robots, we are humans. We have subjectivity in the way that we approach things, and maybe that's good. Maybe that allows us to create wonderful ideas. But then that means that we need to acknowledge the imperfections of ourselves and of our thought processes, which then requires us to be humble. And I think that that's something that we could that's hard for many to face, but is worth facing because we could probably do better science.
I really like what you said. Yeah, that was really fantastic. And it reminds me first of this paper that I can't remember what the exact title was. It was like a method for transferring ideas through millennia, and it said that's folklore or something, that mythology or such. There was a paper recently about that. It was a scientific paper, but it was saying a very efficient method to transfer a lot of data over a very long time seems to be folklore or something, or mythology, which is very interesting and counterintuitive, right? Like the ways that we write. And the second thing that what you brought to my mind is that after many years of being in a particular field, you do, at least I know there is a moment where I start developing a feeling. Then it's no longer just knowledge. I have a feeling for it. Like I don't know if, I'm sure that maybe it's a 10,000 hours thing or something. It's happened to me with math. It has happened with like reinforcement learning. It's happened with music. It's happened with philosophy. There is a point where I'm no longer a reader or recipient. It just completely transfers. I have very clear feelings about theories or ideas, or in something that I'm observing, it translates with the feeling towards some theory.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, Feynman, Schrodinger, Dirac all spoke about this moment when you could now do exactly what you're saying through practice, where you could intuit the answer without having to go methodically through the derivation. It's exactly that, right? And and it's interesting. I remember going to a Festschrift for Eric Kandel, and this was decades ago. And Richard Axel got up and said something very interesting, which was, he said there was something mystical about the experiments that Kandel chose to do. He couldn't quite get how he got there. Right, and he used the word mystical, which I thought was quite bold. But I think again, this idea of what Ida's saying has been debated for ages. You practice enough at an area that you have these intuitive, abstract objects you think with that don't require going through each step of the granular details anymore, right? And I think that again, that's what actually is talked about in the philosophy of mathematical proofs. It's this: I know this is going to be right before I finish doing the derivation. Right, and so we just don't know what that is, but I don't think that's going to be that different from a Virginia Woolf passage. I'm just not convinced. I mean, we don't know.
I totally agree, and in fact, in many times in the field of memory, we start the examples by Alice in Wonderland quote or a Proust quote or something, because people will immediately, with that simple example, know the whole point of the research. And that keeps the glue together, because if you're explaining something, people get bored or they might look at their phone. You bring them back to this, and you're like, this thing in the fMRI relates to this Proust thing, which is episodic memory. You have the eclair, and it takes you back to your childhood all of a sudden. Or for me, contemporary art, like I absolutely am addicted to contemporary art since I was a teenager. And I think that it creates these multi-dimensional experience that you have. It's not just one piece that you just look at, but like an experience. And that experience becomes like an abstract sort of quantum of thought. And the more complex that experience, that quantum is, the more complex thinking all of a sudden becomes possible. And speaking of Walter Benjamin in the sense of a collage. So truth is not this kind of coherent story that you might be telling yourself, but all these collage of different images and different kinds of abstractions have this moment of like illumination that he calls in his work. And with relation to historical materialism, his idea is that moment of illumination, what it does is that it puts a brake on a train that's going. This train of progress is going, it's going. It's a concept that appears in his thesis on historical materialism too, about Paul Klee's painting, in fact, Angelus Novus, where this angel is looking at the past and the progress is happening. It's like with its wing open and its mouth open, and the wind of progress is pushing it to back. And it wants to go to fix things, but the pile of debris of the past is piling up. And this image and the idea of the train and the collage are the ways in which Benjamin passed on these philosophical ideas, that there is a moment where things click for you. And what happens is not that you just progress faster, it's that you slow down or even break. And that's the kind of the thing that maybe curiosity or fear that Ivana was mentioning, or these affective aspects do. They just slow you down. And at some point you're like, oh, why am I doing these things of like, the treadmill of grants and whatnot? I want to answer this. Let me think about this. Let me take a moment. And I think that was some of the most important, I guess, the thrill of the unknown is that moment where it puts a brake. It's like, stop the treadmill. Like, just try another thing, or just sit with this. This is new. You don't know what's going on. And all the treadmill and the train and the training didn't tell you what was going on there. So I want to say something in favor of this kind of collage of various things from different disciplines that at some moment all of a sudden illuminate something. And you just pause. So it's not about value. It's not about progress. It's not about productivity or good questions. It's just pause, a moment of, oh, let me take this in. Something just happened. Something qualitative just changed. I haven't seen a study of it. It's not the aha moment.
There is stuff.
It's not the aha moment.
Yeah, I mean,
actually, I think we need an older tradition to talk about this. So Buddhism, Zen Buddhism specifically has moments of Kinsho and Shoshin, awakening, right? And these are not moments where you're suddenly enlightened and you know everything. These are profound moments where your relationship with the world, with the object, with whatever it is you're engaging with has been so completely transformed that you can no longer see it in the same way. And I think this kind of captures what you're getting at, Ida, when everything comes together and it kind of clicks and you're fundamentally reoriented to all the disparate parts such that they come together in a generally felt cohesive whole. And this is in the writings of Dogen, in the writings of Takuan Soho, in the writings of EQ, in the writings of numerous other Buddhist masters, the experience of both Kinsho and Shoshin, and it happens all the time over and over and over and over again as you get better and better at least in the Buddhist tradition, interrogating the nature in the world, and in Buddhist-inspired art, practicing the kind of, or engaging in the practice that you're working at, right? So talented martial artists have this moment when they understand the relationship of all other techniques to one technique. Ueshiba says this about Ikkyo. It's a 100-year technique because it grounds everything. Ida, you said you did dance. There's probably been a moment where you are dancing and you recognize the broader connections of these things as they come together. But so all of this is to go back. All this is to say that, maybe we need to look again at older and more ancient traditions to find the answers, or if not the answers, the language to talk about these experiences that have come to characterize a lot of what we're doing in our more advanced and our more scientific kinds of engagements.
Well, all I can say is that for those students or people who watch this on YouTube, I can say that, Perry and Dani, you will be the ones burnt at the stake for the heresy that you've triggered here in terms of how we should go back to science. On that very issue, one more book plug that I'll make based on what Jonathan just said. There's Susanna Clarke wrote this book, Piranesi, that came out last year. She wrote a novel called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell that was a big bestseller 18 years ago. But she wrote this short volume, and it's very much, I think, the theme of this, I won't give it away, is that you have to go back to sort of more ancient traditions of communion to sort of counterbalance where we've gotten to now, I think, with this divide. It's kind of fun. I think it gets to exactly what Jonathan is saying. That's my interpretation of it. You can all, but I do recommend it. It seems to be a meditation on this very issue. I actually have to go. I feel like this has been a truly, it's the essence of what we're trying to do, I think, with this salon. I'm deeply grateful to both of you. And I hope you don't feel like you were taken down all sorts of tributaries, right? I hope it's what you expected.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you for having us.
John, before you go, sorry, Perry.
I would just say we want to be taken down many tributaries. I mean, that is precisely the point, I think, for us.
I was going to say, I totally agree. And I think it's within our power. Like, we write lots of papers. We can use first person pronouns, and we can add literary quotes. And when we're reviewing papers, instead of saying take them out, we can say add them in. Like, it's up to us. We are the ones doing the science. I mean, obviously, lots of, what?
It gets perverse. I mean, I remember
John can do it though.
I remember like a decade ago or more now, with friends, we said, could we find a way to get silly words into our scientific manuscripts without being caught, like wombat and things like that, and find a way that it wouldn't get caught, right? But it should be that we shouldn't have to do that. We should be able to do what Jovo's saying. And actually, just to be on a personal note, I remember on 2 papers where we wanted to write into the methods, we made a mistake. We thought we should do this, but actually, in retrospect, we realized we had to change. And we just wanted to write that sentence, right? That we got it wrong, and we admit it, and it's messy, and we were excoriated about that. That wasn't even literary. I mean, it didn't even rhyme, right? It was just, it's actually fascinating. So I really looking forward to your book, and and thank you loads. You guys are awesome. And by the way, just so you know, Perry, and Dani, is that all that stuff that's going on in the chat you can get access to from us, because it's very rich material and you've precipitated it, so you should get to see it all. That's right? I'm not misspeaking, right? No, okay. All right.
2 things. John, people are asking about the reference you mentioned about ancient ways of communion. So
yeah. I'll do it right now.
Second thing, before I say thank you to Perry and to Dani, I want to say that next week we're going to discuss Atlas of AI by Kate Crawford. Kate Crawford is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research, and also one of the founders of AI Now Institute, very active in AI ethics, also critical theory tradition. So we're having like 2 critical theory heavy sessions, one after in 2 consecutive weeks, which is a dream come true for me. So please join us next week. And I just want to thank Dani and Perry a lot, profusely, because this has been fantastic. I don't think we've had this much mention of this many philosophers, even in the sessions where we've had philosophers. So I think this has been quite fantastic, and the chat is just a jewel. That has been fantastic. All the references everyone shared. Thank you, everyone, for all the questions you asked. Thank you to, of course, John and Jovo, but especially to our behind-the-scene heroes who actually keep this running. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Kanaka. And thank you, everyone, for such a great discussion. John, do you want to say the outro or something? But
no. I hope I see you soon, Dani. To be honest, and
I hope so.
And this was really, really wonderful, and just loved it. Made my week.
Me
Take
too.
care. Bye.
Take care.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.